The city of Melbourne lay under a soft, golden haze as the sun dipped behind its skyline, casting long, stretching shadows across the quiet streets. By day, the city appeared ordinary, trams gliding past colonial-era buildings, pedestrians moving briskly along footpaths, shopfronts closing one by one, but as dusk settled, an undercurrent of tension began to stir. In the backstreets and dimly lit laneways, the city's hidden rhythms pulsed quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the heartbeat of a creature waiting to awaken. Smoke from small factories and late-night kitchens mingled with the evening air, carrying hints of roasting meat, coal, and the faint tang of the nearby Yarra River. It was a city alive with contrasts, beauty and decay, order and chaos, quiet civility hiding restless ambition. In these subtle tensions, the seeds of conflict were already taking root. Melbourne of the late 1970s and early 1980s was a city on the brink of transformation, caught between its polished, outwardly calm image and the turbulent forces moving beneath its surface. Wealth and opportunity drew people from all corners of the country, while unemployment, social disparity, and the rise of organized crime created fertile ground for ambition to fester in unexpected places. The streets, so orderly during the day, seemed to change personality under the evening lights. Neon signs flickered in the alleyways, reflecting off wet cobblestones after sudden rains, and shadows stretched long across walls, hinting at unseen figures slipping through the darkness. The city had become a chessboard, and the players were invisible but keenly felt. Alongside the elegant cafes and buzzing nightlife, there were pockets of tension that the untrained eye might miss. In a quiet corner of Collingwood, a group of young men gathered near a battered car, exchanging whispered words and cautious glances. Across town, in Richmond, a similar scene unfolded, another group, another plan, another set of eyes watching for opportunity. These individuals were unremarkable by most standards, workers, sons of tradesmen, boys whose lives had begun much like anyone else's in Melbourne. Yet beneath ordinary appearances, a certain edge, a hunger, a restlessness marked them. Something inside them sensed that the city, with all its lights and glittering promise, was also a place of risk and reward, a landscape where courage, or perhaps recklessness, could elevate one to heights unimaginable. The Yarra River wound silently through the city, reflecting the fading orange and pink of the sunset, a tranquil observer to the growing undercurrents of power and ambition. Bridges arched over the water, carrying cars and trams, pedestrians and secret dealings alike. At first glance, it seemed impossible that such a serene scene could coexist with the brewing storm. But the city had always held dualities, the glamorous and the grim, the respectable and the dangerous, the legal and the illicit. Melbourne streets whispered stories that few noticed, tales of quiet ambition, unspoken rivalries, and opportunities lurking in plain sight. Every lamppost cast a shadow that could hide a secret, every quiet alleyway held the promise of chance or threat. Even the ordinary sounds of the city, the click of heels on pavement, the rumble of distant trains, the low murmur of conversations drifting from pubs, took on a new dimension at night. To those attuned, these sounds were part of a larger symphony, a rhythm of control, caution, and unseen movements. Each step taken along the cobblestones, each glance over a shoulder, seemed to carry weight beyond its appearance. It was in this world that the Melbourne Crew would eventually emerge, a collection of young men whose ambitions, boldness, and cunning would soon leave an indelible mark on the city. At this point, they were not yet legends, nor were they villains in the eyes of the public. They were shadows moving through streets, feeling the pulse of a city unaware of the storm that would soon reach its very heart. In the distance, the hum of factories continued, their lights flickering intermittently against the encroaching night. Smoke rose slowly into the sky, curling and twisting, dissolving into the cool evening air. On quiet streets, old shop fronts and apartment buildings held secrets behind shuttered windows. And in those spaces, unseen eyes watched, calculated, and waited. It was a world that demanded patience, observation, and a willingness to embrace risk. The city, for all its apparent calm, was a canvas waiting for bold strokes, and the brush had not yet been picked up. The stage was being set not with violence or grandeur, but with subtle anticipation. Small acts, whispered deals, unnoticed glances, and careful positioning formed the prelude to a saga that would alter Melbourne's very identity. The crew's path had not yet been drawn, but the first moves were quietly taking shape. In parks where children once played, in pubs where conversations meandered lazily into the night, and in alleys where the faint smell of oil and dampness mingled, Melbourne was preparing for change. By the time the city fully realized it, the crew would have already claimed their influence, shaping streets, neighborhoods, and destinies. And so the night descended, calm yet expectant, on a city oblivious to the forces quietly assembling within it. The streets of Melbourne, bathed in the soft glow of gaslights and neon, whispered of ambition, danger, and opportunity. Somewhere amidst the shadows, the young men who would become the Melbourne Crew took their first tentative steps toward the life that awaited them. The city's pulse quickened imperceptibly, carrying in its rhythm the promise of stories yet to unfold, the suspense of power yet to be seized, and the quiet thrill of a storm approaching on the horizon. As the moon rose over the Yarra, casting silver reflections on water and streets alike, Melbourne slept, or pretended to, unaware that its nights would never again be quite the same. In the quieter corners of Melbourne, far from the city's polished streets and bustling nightlife, a new chapter of the city's hidden story was beginning to take shape. It was in these neighborhoods, Collingwood, Richmond, St. Kilda, that ordinary lives intersected with the subtle pull of something darker, something that promised power, wealth, and influence beyond the reach of most. The young men who would form what would later be known as the Melbourne Crew were not born with notoriety or destiny stamped across their foreheads. They were sons of tradesmen, small business owners, and working families, growing up in modest homes where the rhythms of daily life were defined by routines, chores, and small dreams. Yet beneath the ordinary surface, there was a restlessness that could not be contained, a hunger to step beyond the boundaries society had quietly drawn for them. Childhoods were spent in narrow streets where streetlights flickered hesitantly, creating pools of shadow that seemed to beckon for mischief or adventure. These boys learned early the lessons of observation, of knowing which neighbors watched too closely, which paths were safe, and which corners were best avoided. Games of skill, minor thefts, and testing boundaries became exercises in understanding the delicate balance of risk and reward. They discovered that charm, cunning, and timing were just as valuable as strength or courage. In quiet moments, sitting on curbs or leaning against rusting fences, they shared stories of ambitions that reached beyond the fences of their neighborhoods. They spoke of respect, of reputation, and of a world that rewarded daring and audacity. Some came from families that struggled to make ends meet, where the clinking of coins in a pocket carried more weight than the promises of school or steady work. Others had experienced relative comfort, but were drawn to the thrill of the streets and the allure of influence that the city's hidden world offered. In the pubs that lined the laneways, and in the dim backrooms of social clubs, whispers of illicit deals, gambling, and underground opportunity floated in the air like smoke. These whispers fascinated the young men, promising a life that combined risk with reward, strategy with instinct. Slowly, connections began to form. Paths converged. What might have remained scattered ambitions and individual mischief began to crystallize into a network of loyalty and shared purpose. The Melbourne Crew did not emerge overnight. Their formation was gradual, almost imperceptible. A handshake here, a favor there, a shared understanding of which streets belonged to whom, these small acts laid the groundwork for a structured, disciplined, and remarkably effective group. Even at this early stage, their interactions displayed an unspoken hierarchy. Some naturally took leadership roles, commanding attention through charisma and decisiveness, while others contributed through skill, stealth, or loyalty. Each individual brought a unique strength to the collective, and together, they began to understand that there was a world waiting to be shaped by those bold enough to seize it. The neighborhoods themselves, with their narrow lanes, brick row houses, and scattered shops, provided both playground and training ground. The young men learned to navigate their environment with subtlety and precision, slipping unseen through alleyways, gauging the temperament of local residents, and understanding the city as a living map of opportunity and risk. Every graffiti-marked wall, every flickering streetlight, every worn doorway became a reference point in their growing awareness of territory, power, and influence. In these lessons, the first seeds of strategy were planted, teaching patience, foresight, and the quiet art of control. Yet for all their growing understanding of the streets, there remained an undercurrent of tension. Not all in the neighborhoods welcomed their presence or ambition. Rival groups, older gangs, and opportunistic criminals viewed the newcomers with suspicion, curiosity, or outright hostility. It was in these early encounters that the young men learned crucial lessons about reputation, negotiation, and a careful balance between caution and aggression. A glance could be a warning, a slight could spark conflict, and a well-timed act of respect or generosity could secure allies for years to come. These small, almost imperceptible social maneuvers would later prove essential when larger battles and turf wars loomed on the horizon. Even as they honed their skills in the subtle politics of their streets, the boys maintained glimpses of ordinary lives. School, family obligations, casual jobs, and fleeting moments of leisure provided a counterbalance to their growing immersion in the city's hidden undercurrents. In these quiet, almost mundane moments, the contrasts of their lives were stark. By day, ordinary youth with ordinary hopes; by night, strategists and observers of a world most would never see. This duality became part of their identity, sharpening their awareness and adding complexity to the bonds forming within the group. Loyalty, trust, and discretion were not mere words, they were tools for survival. Over time, these early experiences, shared risks, and subtle alliances coalesced into something far larger than themselves. They were no longer just individuals testing the limits of their neighborhoods, they were a unit, capable of exerting influence, commanding attention, and quietly reshaping the balance of power. Their ambitions were no longer whispered dreams, they became plans, carefully considered and deliberately executed. The city, in its sprawling complexity, offered endless opportunity to those who understood its rhythms, and the Melbourne Crew began to master them with surprising precision. By the late 1970s, the Crew had begun to establish its identity, not yet in headlines, but in the murmurs of the streets. They were known to some, watched by others, and underestimated by many. In a city of millions, the extraordinary was quietly emerging from the ordinary, and the pieces of a future empire were being set in place. These formative years, though calm in retrospect, were the crucible in which the Crew's character, strategy, and ambition were forged. Every cautious maneuver, every alliance, every silent observation contributed to the foundation of a force that would soon make Melbourne itself the stage for their audacious rise. And so, beneath the soft glow of gaslights and the faint hum of distant trams, Melbourne waited unknowingly for the story that was quietly taking root in its backstreets. The individuals who would become the Melbourne Crew moved through the city with purpose, their ambitions small yet relentless, their understanding of the streets deepening with every day. It was here, in the ordinary corners of an extraordinary city, that their journey began, quiet, deliberate, and inexorably heading toward a future that would turn Melbourne into both a playground and a battlefield. The first steps into crime for the young men of Melbourne were small, almost unremarkable in isolation, yet they carried with them the faint thrill of transgression that would grow into something far larger. It began with minor thefts, petty scams, and neighborhood hustles, slight acts that tested courage, skill, and the boundaries of the law. A wallet slipped from an unsuspecting passerby's pocket, a car parked briefly at the curb quietly examined for opportunity, or a few notes from a small store pocketed under the faint hum of fluorescent lights, these were the first lessons in risk and reward. With each successful act, confidence grew, and with it, the awareness that power could be claimed not through sheer force alone, but through careful observation, timing, and a measure of audacity. Even as they walked the streets at dusk, eyes alert to opportunity, there was a strange rhythm to their lives. By day, they blended with ordinary Melbourne youth, attending school, completing shifts at factories, and maintaining appearances that hid the careful calculation simmering beneath the surface. By night, however, they became participants in a silent education in criminality, learning to read people, sense threats, and recognize the subtle hierarchies of their environment. The city itself became a teacher, each alleyway a lesson, each encounter a puzzle to be solved. Mistakes were quietly noted and rarely repeated, while successes were celebrated in whispers and knowing glances, building reputation as skill and daring became evident. These early crimes were rarely violent, but they required a certain audacity. The thrill came not only from the act itself but from the intricate dance of observation and deception. A shopkeeper distracted by conversation, a passerby inattentive to the shadows, the slight slack in a security guard's vigilance, all became opportunities for learning and growth. Each act, though small, carried consequences that shaped the young men's understanding of risk, a glance over the shoulder that betrayed nervousness, a narrow escape that left hearts pounding, or the quiet approval of a peer impressed by cleverness. In these moments, the seeds of strategy, improvisation, and psychological insight were sown, and the groundwork for more ambitious undertakings was laid. Charisma, too, became a tool as essential as stealth. Among themselves, they learned to navigate alliances, negotiate favors, and assert dominance without resorting to violence unnecessarily. These early interactions taught that influence could be cultivated through reputation, the careful display of confidence, and an understanding of who could be trusted and who could not. A wink, a nod, a whispered promise, small gestures carried weight in these formative moments, and those who understood their subtle power quickly rose in stature. Reputation became currency, and every act, every interaction, contributed to the building of a presence that was quietly growing in influence across the neighborhoods. It was during this time that mentors began to emerge, individuals already versed in the unspoken rules of Melbourne's criminal world. They were not always formally recognized leaders but figures whose experience commanded attention. From them, the young men learned techniques, strategies, and codes of conduct that would guide their ascent. The lessons were delivered calmly yet firmly: loyalty, discretion, patience, and the careful weighing of risk against reward. Sometimes a mentor's presence was overt, offering advice in backrooms or quiet corners of bars; other times, it was subtle, felt in the observation of how seasoned figures moved, spoke, and dealt with conflict. Each encounter contributed to a growing understanding that the streets, though familiar, were far more complex than they had imagined. The first brushes with the law added another dimension to their education. Arrests, interrogations, and narrow escapes left lasting impressions. Some were released with warnings, others with minor convictions, but all left with a heightened awareness of scrutiny and consequence. Each run-in taught patience, calculation, and the value of subtlety. They began to understand that the world was both forgiving and unforgiving, that a misstep could lead to disaster, and that every choice carried weight. These lessons, learned in tense moments under harsh lights or through whispered warnings from those who had survived similar situations, added layers to their growing sophistication. Even amidst these small crimes, the young men maintained a sense of observation that extended beyond immediate gain. They studied rival groups, the habits of local law enforcement, and the structure of the neighborhoods themselves. Knowledge of territory became as important as the ability to act decisively within it. By noting who controlled which streets, who tolerated which activities, and which areas were overlooked or vulnerable, they built a mental map of opportunity and threat that would guide every future action. The streets were no longer merely a backdrop; they were a living, breathing environment demanding attention, patience, and respect. Friendships deepened in these formative moments, bonded by shared risk and shared understanding. Trust was both fragile and precious, constantly tested through the execution of plans, the handling of setbacks, and the navigation of unforeseen obstacles. Those who proved reliable became pillars within the group, their reliability earning not only trust but influence. Those who faltered risked exclusion, quietly learning that loyalty and competence were valued above brashness or impulse. In this way, the crew began to understand the dynamics that would later define their internal hierarchy and the cohesion that made them formidable. By the end of this period, the young men had transformed from street-smart youths into emerging strategists, cautiously expanding the scope of their operations. The minor thefts and neighborhood hustles that once seemed daring now served as stepping stones toward more ambitious endeavors. Each act, whether successful or flawed, contributed to a cumulative understanding of risk, influence, and opportunity. They were no longer just reacting to their environment; they were beginning to shape it, to assert their presence in subtle but undeniable ways. The city of Melbourne, still unaware, watched silently. The streets that had seemed ordinary were quietly being mapped and mastered by a new generation, learning the delicate balance of power, respect, and ambition. By the time the world would recognize them as the Melbourne Crew, these formative steps, small, careful, and often unnoticed, would have already defined much of their identity. They had learned that crime was not simply action or chaos, but a careful negotiation of environment, people, and consequence. And in these early lessons, the foundations of an empire, with all its danger, influence, and intrigue, were quietly being laid. As the Melbourne Crew grew bolder in their small-scale ventures, the city's underworld began to reveal itself in greater detail, a web of alliances, rivalries, and hidden power structures that would shape the trajectory of their rise. The boys who had once simply navigated the streets as observers now found themselves drawn into a world of subtle negotiation, unspoken codes, and quiet intimidation. They were learning that control was never absolute, that influence came from relationships as much as from action, and that every interaction, however small, could ripple outward in unforeseen ways. Melbourne's hidden landscape of crime was intricate, a delicate lattice where a single misstep could shift the balance of power. The underworld itself was a complex ecosystem. Older gangs, some well entrenched for decades, patrolled their territories with silent vigilance. Clubs, bars, and late-night businesses acted as informal hubs where alliances were forged and tested, while rivalries simmered beneath polite conversation. Here, a careless comment, an improperly timed gesture, or the wrong expression of respect could spark conflict, sometimes immediate, sometimes delayed. The Melbourne Crew began to study these dynamics with the same meticulous attention they had applied to mapping neighborhoods and streets. They observed hierarchies, the flow of information, and the subtle ways influence was exerted without overt confrontation. Introductions were made carefully, often under the guise of casual social interaction. A handshake over a game of pool, a friendly wager in a poker room, or a conversation in a quiet corner of a club could serve as both greeting and assessment. The crew learned quickly which figures commanded genuine respect, and which relied on intimidation or reputation alone. Trust was always provisional, and loyalty had to be earned. The nuances of body language, tone of voice, and timing became essential tools in navigating a world where words alone were never sufficient. These lessons were not taught formally, they were absorbed through observation, trial, and error, and the quiet feedback of those already experienced in the city's criminal hierarchy. Rivalries, too, became apparent, not always through direct confrontation but often in the subtle ways territory was respected, ignored, or challenged. The crew discovered that power could be asserted without violence, through strategic positioning, information gathering, or the careful cultivation of allies. The early encounters with these rival figures were instructive. A glance exchanged on a street corner, a remark overheard in a bar, the manner in which an established gangster dismissed or acknowledged them, all conveyed important information. From these interactions, the young men began to understand the delicate balance between asserting influence and avoiding provocation that could lead to unnecessary conflict. It was during this period that the Melbourne Crew also started to recognize the value of discipline and organization. They had learned in their minor crimes the importance of planning and coordination, but now the stakes were higher, and the scale of operations required structure. Roles were informally assigned based on skill, temperament, and reliability. Some members excelled at negotiation and persuasion, others at observation and intelligence gathering, and some at logistics or enforcement. These roles, fluid at first, gradually solidified as trust and competence became evident. The crew was becoming more than a group of friends or neighborhood hustlers, it was beginning to operate like a cohesive unit, capable of coordinated action that far exceeded the sum of its parts. The city itself provided both opportunity and caution. Every district had its unique characteristics, its own informal rulers, and its own vulnerabilities. A quiet pub in Fitzroy might serve as a neutral ground for negotiations, while a warehouse in South Melbourne could be leveraged as a storage point for goods or as a staging area for a more ambitious plan. Knowledge of geography, social networks, and timing became critical. The crew observed patterns in pedestrian and vehicle movement, noted the routines of law enforcement, and identified the moments when oversight was weakest. These observations were applied not through haste, but with patience, waiting for the right moment to act, for the right combination of circumstances to align. Alliances were carefully nurtured, often through subtle acts of favor, shared risk, or demonstration of reliability. A minor debt collected, a small problem solved for an ally, or quiet assistance during a tense situation could establish goodwill that might be repaid months or even years later. The crew understood that influence in this world was rarely immediate, it was cumulative, built through repeated acts of competence, discretion, and loyalty. They also learned to read the hidden tensions between others, friendships that masked rivalry, loyalties that could fracture under pressure, and grudges that simmered beneath the surface. Recognizing these subtleties became as important as the actions they themselves undertook. Mentorship continued to play a role in this phase. Experienced figures in the underworld offered guidance, sometimes indirectly, through their behavior, sometimes directly, through quiet counsel or demonstration. The crew absorbed these lessons, gradually internalizing the unspoken rules that governed conduct, negotiation, and conflict. They were learning not just to act, but to anticipate, to strategize, and to understand the psychology of both allies and adversaries. The city became their classroom, and the underworld their curriculum. As the crew's confidence grew, so too did their ambition. Simple neighborhood skirmishes and petty crimes were no longer sufficient to satisfy the drive that had been quietly growing within them. They began to see the possibilities of expansion, the potential to exert influence over larger areas, and the power of reputation as a tool for control. The network they were building, the alliances they were forging, and the understanding of the city's subtle hierarchies all pointed toward a future in which they could command attention, respect, and authority far beyond their initial circle. By the time the Melbourne Crew fully understood the structure of the underworld around them, they were no longer outsiders. They had learned the rhythm of the city, the protocols of interaction, and the silent calculus that governed power. Each step, each careful engagement, each observed interaction brought them closer to a position where they could shape events rather than merely react to them. The streets of Melbourne, once just the backdrop to youthful exploration, had become a map of possibility, a landscape that they could navigate with precision, patience, and foresight. And so, the Melbourne Crew stood at the threshold of transformation. The underworld, with all its hidden currents, alliances, and rivalries, was no longer a distant, abstract force. It was tangible, navigable, and increasingly within their grasp. Every glance, every handshake, every calculated move contributed to a growing understanding of how power operated in the city's shadows. The crew was learning not just to survive within this world, but to thrive, and in doing so, they were laying the foundations for the conflicts, alliances, and triumphs that would soon define Melbourne streets in ways both visible and unseen. The first true clashes that would mark the Melbourne Crew's emergence as a formidable force were subtle at first, hidden in the ordinary hum of city life, yet they carried a weight that resonated far beyond their immediate surroundings. It began with the quiet assertion of territory, claiming certain streets, clubs, or local hangouts as spaces under their influence. These were not violent confrontations in the way the world would later remember them, but they were tense, charged, and instructive, each encounter a lesson in power, presence, and perception. A hand placed firmly on a door handle before a rival could enter, a casual remark delivered with controlled authority, or the quiet placement of someone's reputation in the correct hierarchy all signaled that the crew was no longer merely participants in the underworld, they were becoming architects of it. In the backstreets and alleys of Collingwood and Richmond, tensions quietly escalated. Rival gangs, long accustomed to controlling specific corners of the city, began to notice the crew's subtle movements. At first, these rivalries were little more than exchanges of glare or quiet challenges, gestures that might have gone unnoticed by outsiders but carried heavy meaning within the criminal ecosystem. The young men of the crew learned quickly that violence, while sometimes necessary, was only one tool among many. Strategic intimidation, clever negotiation, and careful displays of loyalty and capability often achieved far more than a fight ever could. Every encounter became a study in balance, when to act, when to wait, and when to retreat under the guise of diplomacy. The streets themselves seemed to pulse with quiet anticipation during these early confrontations. The crew moved with heightened awareness, noting patterns in pedestrian traffic, the routes of police patrols, and the behavior of rival factions. Even the smallest gestures could serve as both signal and test, a nod, a pause at a familiar corner, the positioning of a vehicle, or the presence of a familiar face in a pub. Each action, while calm and deliberate, was imbued with significance. The crew learned to read these subtleties as fluently as any spoken language, understanding that power often operated in the space between words and deeds. One of the earliest incidents that left a lasting impression involved a disputed club in South Melbourne. Both the crew and a rival gang had begun frequenting the same establishment, each asserting subtle dominance through quiet displays of presence and influence. The situation was tense but contained, a delicate dance of posturing and observation. The crew's members moved with care, noting the rival group's habits, alliances, and weaknesses. Small acts, who was greeted first, who was offered a drink, who was ignored, became part of a silent negotiation, a chess game played in the soft glow of dimmed lights. By the time any direct confrontation occurred, each move had been calculated, every risk measured, and the crew emerged with influence quietly consolidated, having demonstrated strength without unnecessary conflict. The lessons of these early clashes extended beyond strategy into the realm of psychology. The crew learned that fear could be both weapon and shield, and that reputation often carried more weight than action alone. A whispered warning, a carefully placed rumor, or the mere suggestion of influence could redirect rival ambitions without the need for a physical altercation. They observed how other gangs managed their own internal dynamics, how loyalty and paranoia intertwined, and how authority could be asserted subtly, without overt declaration. This understanding became a cornerstone of their approach. Influence was rarely claimed by brute force, it was earned through perception, patience, and a careful calibration of risk. Amid these encounters, the crew's internal cohesion became increasingly vital. Each member had a role, a strength, and an understanding of the collective objective. Observation, intelligence gathering, negotiation, and enforcement were distributed among those best suited to each task. Mistakes were rare but instructive, often discussed quietly afterward, with the emphasis on learning rather than blame. Trust was both the currency and the glue that held the group together, and each clash with a rival tested the durability of that trust. As they moved through these formative conflicts, the crew's reputation began to solidify, not as mere troublemakers, but as a unit capable of thoughtful, calculated action. The city itself, largely unaware of the undercurrents, seemed to provide both cover and stage. Late-night streets, dimly lit laneways, and quiet pubs acted as arenas where influence could be asserted without drawing unwanted attention. Observers might see nothing more than groups of young men walking or conversing, yet beneath the surface, alliances were tested, rivalries marked, and authority quietly established. These early skirmishes were formative, teaching lessons that would echo in larger conflicts to come. Every glance, every pause, every carefully measured word contributed to a growing mastery of the hidden dynamics that governed the city's criminal landscape. Even as the crew asserted themselves externally, internal lessons were equally significant. Members began to recognize the importance of coordination, communication, and discretion. Acting as individuals might yield short-term gains, but sustained influence required a disciplined, united front. The early turf negotiations demonstrated that success depended not only on boldness but also on careful planning, observation, and timing. In these moments, the crew was learning to operate as a single organism, each member anticipating the other's moves, supporting when necessary, and stepping back when discretion demanded. By the end of this period, Melbourne streets had subtly shifted under the crew's influence. Rival factions had been observed, measured, and quietly tested, and the young men had established a presence that could not easily be ignored. The first turf wars, while modest in scale compared to what would follow, were vital in shaping the crew's identity and strategy. They had learned the delicate balance between assertion and restraint, between visibility and subtlety, and between intimidation and diplomacy. In these early encounters, the foundation for their rise was laid, a combination of skill, patience, perception, and quiet audacity that would define their influence in the city for years to come. The quiet of Melbourne streets at night contrasted sharply with the undercurrent of change. Streetlights flickered against wet cobblestones, trams rumbled in the distance, and the soft murmur of late-night patrons drifted from pubs and cafes. Beneath this veneer of normalcy, the crew's presence was becoming tangible. They were no longer merely observers of the city's hidden rhythms, they were active participants, shaping outcomes, testing rivalries, and quietly asserting dominance. These early clashes, subtle and calculated, were the first clear signs that Melbourne streets would never be quite the same, as the crew prepared to step fully into the city's underworld, one deliberate move at a time. As the Melbourne Crew consolidated its presence on the city streets, attention slowly turned inward, toward the fragile bonds and intricate hierarchies that would sustain, or ultimately fracture, the group. Beyond the thrill of minor heists and subtle territorial negotiations, there lay the unspoken rules that governed their cohesion, loyalty, discretion, and the quiet understanding that trust was a rare and precious commodity. The crew had learned how to observe rivals, negotiate influence, and assert authority, but their greatest challenge lay not in the city outside, but in the hearts and minds of those who moved alongside them. Within these early alliances, the seeds of both strength and tension began to take root. Internal loyalty was never assumed. It was tested repeatedly, often in small ways that revealed character as clearly as any confrontation. A favor performed without expectation, a quiet intervention during a tense moment, or the careful execution of a plan demonstrated commitment. Conversely, a misstep, an act of recklessness, an unnecessary breach of protocol, or a failure to honor an agreement, could plant doubt, eroding the trust that had taken months to cultivate. The crew's members learned early that relationships within the group were dynamic, requiring constant attention and subtle calibration. Authority was recognized not through force alone, but through reliability, judgment, and the consistent demonstration of competence. Discipline, too, became essential. As the crew's activities grew in scope and complexity, the need for coordinated action became increasingly evident. Each member assumed specific responsibilities, some focused on surveillance, others on negotiation, logistics, or enforcement. No single individual could control the entirety of the crew's operations, yet each action, whether small or large, had consequences for the group as a whole. Mistakes were addressed with a quiet rigor, discussions in secluded corners, lessons conveyed with calm authority, and a focus on improvement rather than punishment. In this way, the internal culture of the crew evolved, balancing flexibility with structure, spontaneity with measured planning. Yet even the most disciplined group is vulnerable to tension. Ambition, ego, and differing visions of risk began to emerge among members, subtle at first but increasingly influential. The allure of power, the temptation of shortcuts, and the challenge of individual desires occasionally clashed with the collective objective. These tensions were rarely explosive, rather, they manifested in whispered disagreements, careful tests of influence, or minor deviations from agreed-upon plans. Observing and managing these undercurrents became as important as managing the external threats posed by rival gangs or law enforcement. Those who could navigate both realms, external and internal, demonstrated the qualities that would later define leadership within the crew. Betrayal, although not yet widespread, was a concept that loomed quietly over every decision. In the criminal world, loyalty was a currency, and the consequences of its absence were severe. Rumors, subtle tests, and occasional acts of discretion served to gauge allegiance, revealing those whose commitment was genuine and those whose intentions were less certain. The crew's more experienced members understood the delicate balance between trust and suspicion, guiding younger members through the careful observation of behavior, the interpretation of words, and the subtle reading of social cues. It was an education in human psychology as much as it was in strategy, teaching that perception could be as influential as action in maintaining cohesion. Amid this tension, rituals and symbols of trust became significant. Shared experiences, whether the quiet completion of a task, Mutual protection during a risky endeavor, or simple acts of support, reinforced bonds and created a sense of identity. These rituals were not ostentatious, they were understated, almost invisible to outsiders, yet carried immense weight within the group. A nod, a handshake, the inclusion in a conversation or a plan, and the acknowledgement of competence were all markers of belonging. Over time, these small signals reinforced cohesion, establishing a shared understanding that the crew's strength derived as much from unity as from skill or strategy. The crew also learned the importance of discretion in maintaining internal trust. Sensitive information, decisions made behind closed doors, and knowledge of vulnerabilities required careful handling. A single careless word could compromise operations, damage relationships, or expose weaknesses to rivals. Members quickly understood that silence was often as powerful as action, that restraint could prevent unnecessary conflict, and that measured communication preserved both authority and loyalty. This culture of discretion, while calm and understated, created an invisible framework that allowed the crew to operate with coherence and effectiveness. Yet even within this controlled environment, human nature remained unpredictable. Emotions, personal ambitions, and moments of doubt could surface at any time. A sudden disagreement, a perceived slight, or a divergence in risk tolerance could test the crew's cohesion. In these moments, the strongest members demonstrated not only authority but empathy and strategic patience, guiding the group through tension without escalation. Over time, these quiet interventions reinforced the hierarchy, strengthened bonds, and ensured that the group could withstand both internal and external pressures. The duality of the crew's existence, external dominance and internal vigilance, created a rhythm that defined their daily lives. Outwardly, they asserted influence over the streets, navigated rivalries, and extended their reach. Inwardly, they monitored loyalty, cultivated trust, and managed the subtle tensions that could erode unity. Every success outside was mirrored by careful attention to internal dynamics, and every internal failure could ripple outward if unchecked. This delicate balance, once mastered, became a cornerstone of the crew's ability to survive and thrive in a dangerous, unpredictable world. By the end of this formative phase, the Melbourne Crew had not only established influence in the city's streets but also a culture of internal discipline and loyalty that would sustain them in the years to come. The careful navigation of relationships, the understanding of human behavior, and the subtle enforcement of codes of conduct created a resilient foundation. They had learned that power was not only about territory or action, it was about the quiet, invisible bonds that held the group together. Loyalty, discretion, and trust were the invisible threads that, woven carefully, would allow the crew to rise, endure, and ultimately shape Melbourne's criminal landscape in profound and lasting ways. With loyalty carefully nurtured and internal hierarchies gradually solidified, the Melbourne Crew began to look outward again, seeking to expand their influence beyond the narrow corners of Collingwood and Richmond. The city, with its intricate streets, bustling neighborhoods, and countless opportunities, presented both promise and peril. The crew had learned the delicate balance of caution and ambition, and now they were poised to test the limits of their reach. Expansion was not undertaken recklessly, every move was deliberate, measured, and informed by months of observation, learning, and subtle negotiation. The streets were no longer just a backdrop, they were a living, responsive landscape that could be shaped with patience and strategy. Early efforts at expansion involved establishing presence in areas previously considered neutral or under the control of other groups. The crew approached these moves carefully, often through subtle gestures and indirect influence. A well-timed appearance at a local pub, a casual engagement with key figures in the area, or the quiet negotiation of minor favors allowed them to stake claims without immediate confrontation. The art of expansion was as much psychological as it was practical, establishing reputation, signaling capability, and demonstrating reliability were as critical as controlling territory physically. These early steps created opportunities to extend influence while minimizing unnecessary conflict, reinforcing the crew's emerging strategy of measured dominance. In some neighborhoods, resistance was subtle but present. Local figures, protective of their influence, tested the crew with small challenges, probing for weakness, observing reactions, and occasionally testing loyalty through veiled threats or minor confrontations. These encounters were instructive, providing the crew with a practical education in diplomacy and conflict resolution. They learned that patience often achieved more than immediate aggression, that demonstrating intelligence and restraint could command respect more effectively than violence, and that perception often carried more weight than actual strength. Each minor negotiation, test, or challenge became a building block in the crew's expanding reputation. Information became the foundation of their growth. The crew invested time in understanding the intricate social networks, economic activities, and informal hierarchies of the neighborhoods they sought to influence. Observing routines, patterns, and vulnerabilities allowed them to identify opportunities that others overlooked. A local business owner's quiet grievances, a mismanaged club, or a rival's overconfidence could all serve as entry points for influence. These observations were quietly shared within the crew, analyzed, and translated into action, demonstrating a level of foresight and strategic thinking that set them apart from less disciplined rivals. Knowledge, they learned, was as powerful as force. The expansion process also highlighted the importance of alliances beyond immediate neighborhoods. The crew began cultivating relationships with figures in distant areas, often through mutual contacts or shared interests. These connections extended their influence, provided access to information, and offered support in times of conflict. Each new relationship was approached with the same care and calculation as the first steps into a new district, assessing reliability, observing behavior, and demonstrating capability before seeking deeper engagement. Through this careful network building, the crew transformed from a localized force into an increasingly influential entity within Melbourne's underworld. As influence spread, so too did the challenges of management. Coordinating activities across multiple neighborhoods required subtle communication, precise timing, and a shared understanding of objectives. Miscommunication could lead to missed opportunities, conflicts with allies, or exposure to rivals. The crew relied on established roles, trust, and discretion to navigate these challenges, ensuring that expansion strengthened rather than destabilized the group. Each successful extension of influence reinforced cohesion, while each minor setback offered lessons in adaptability, patience, and strategy. The expansion also brought new opportunities for profit, as well as new risks. Small businesses, local clubs, and underground enterprises provided avenues for legitimate and illegitimate income alike. Gambling, protection arrangements, and the facilitation of illicit activities became tools not only for wealth but also for establishing and reinforcing influence. The crew learned to manage these operations discreetly, balancing ambition with caution to avoid unnecessary attention from law enforcement or rival factions. Every transaction, favor, or negotiation was carefully considered, ensuring that expansion did not compromise the crew's growing reputation for competence and reliability. As their footprint grew, the crew became increasingly aware of the delicate interplay between visibility and discretion. Too much attention could invite unnecessary scrutiny, while too little could hinder influence. They learned to move in a space between presence and subtlety, demonstrating authority without overt aggression and signaling capability without revealing vulnerability. In doing so, they cultivated a reputation that was both respected and quietly feared, allowing them to extend influence across Melbourne's neighborhoods with minimal conflict. The psychological dimension of expansion became increasingly evident. Rivals began to perceive the crew as more than just a local group. Their reputation, carefully cultivated over months of observation and strategy, preceded them. Word of successful negotiation, careful planning, and discreet handling of disputes spread through informal networks, reinforcing their status without the need for public displays of power. Influence, the crew realized, was often exercised most effectively in the spaces between people's perceptions, quietly shaping decisions, alliances, and rivalries before they became overt. By the end of this phase, the Melbourne Crew had moved from cautious local operators to an organized, strategic force capable of exerting influence across multiple neighborhoods. Expansion was no longer an abstract ambition, it was a carefully managed reality, grounded in observation, diplomacy, and calculated risk. The city itself, once a familiar backdrop, had become a landscape of opportunity and challenge, responsive to their careful maneuvers and strategic foresight. The crew's reputation, meticulously built through measured actions, strategic alliances, and subtle demonstrations of competence, positioned them as a rising power in Melbourne's underworld, ready to confront the larger conflicts and complex rivalries that would soon define their story. As the Melbourne Crew's presence expanded across multiple neighborhoods, the inevitable friction with rival groups began to crystallize into more defined conflicts. These were not yet the chaotic, headline-grabbing confrontations of later years, but they carried the same tension and the quiet gravity that comes with the assertion of power. Each rival faction had its own traditions, boundaries, and hierarchies, and the crew's gradual encroachment into previously neutral or contested areas sparked a subtle, almost imperceptible ripple of attention. For the crew, these early encounters served as lessons in strategy, psychology, and the art of controlled escalation, where every movement required calculation and every reaction measured. The first true turf disputes emerged as a mix of negotiation, intimidation, and silent posturing. A favored bar in Fitzroy, long frequented by a local faction, became a point of subtle contention. The crew began making regular appearances, not through overt challenge, but through understated gestures, a nod here, a casual placement of a member in the room there, a quiet show of competence in resolving minor conflicts for patrons or owners. The rivals noticed these gestures, their attention piqued not by overt action but by the crew's growing presence and calm authority. This slow, deliberate approach minimized the risk of early violence while laying the groundwork for future dominance. Observation remained central to every decision. The crew meticulously studied their rivals' routines, alliances, and internal dynamics. Who could be trusted? Who acted impulsively? Which figures held genuine respect, and which relied solely on reputation? Every detail mattered. Even minor incidents, a poorly timed reaction to a confrontation, a misjudged negotiation, or an oversight in managing their own territory, offered valuable insight. The crew absorbed these lessons, refining their approach with a blend of patience, foresight, and subtle psychological insight. Expansion was no longer just a matter of claiming space, it was about understanding the human terrain that governed influence and authority. Encounters with rivals, while carefully managed, sometimes escalated into brief but intense skirmishes. A misinterpreted gesture, a casual insult, or the presence of a crew member in a disputed area could spark tension. These moments were controlled with remarkable precision, a calm word, a measured step back, or a quiet show of support from allies often diffused situations before they became violent. Yet even when aggression flared, the crew had learned to maintain composure, balancing the immediate need for respect with the long-term necessity of strategy. Each confrontation, no matter how minor, reinforced the importance of discipline, coordination, and psychological acuity. Negotiation became an art form. The crew recognized that not every conflict needed to be settled through force, and that influence could often be secured through careful diplomacy. A favorable arrangement in one neighborhood, allowing the crew to operate without interference in exchange for a subtle recognition of the rival's authority, could prevent escalation and open avenues for further expansion. These negotiations were quiet, often conducted in back rooms or in subtle exchanges on street corners, where words, gestures, and the careful measurement of timing carried weight. Through these early deals, the crew honed a combination of strategic patience, tact, and assertive subtlety that would define their approach in more significant conflicts. The psychological dimension of these early turf disputes cannot be overstated. The crew understood that reputation, perception, and the controlled display of confidence could achieve far more than brute force alone. A whispered warning, a quiet demonstration of competence, or even the strategic placement of information could shape rival decisions before any action was taken. The goal was not merely to control territory, but to shape the perceptions and behavior of others, creating a climate in which the crew's influence was accepted without continuous confrontation. These lessons in psychological strategy became foundational, influencing every subsequent move in their rise. Alliances were carefully cultivated to bolster the crew's position. Neutral figures or minor factions could be drawn into their orbit through subtle favors, discreet assistance, or the quiet demonstration of reliability. These alliances provided intelligence, support, and an additional layer of security in disputed areas. The crew understood that a network of relationships, carefully nurtured and strategically employed, could amplify influence and reduce risk. In many cases, the mere presence of allies in key areas signaled strength, deterring rivals from unnecessary aggression. Expansion, they learned, was rarely a solitary endeavor. It depended on the careful management of connections, reputation, and perception. Even as tensions simmered externally, internal cohesion remained critical. The pressure of navigating rivalries, negotiating alliances, and asserting influence across multiple neighborhoods tested loyalty, patience, and strategic discipline. Coordination, clear communication, and trust were paramount. Mistakes could have cascading effects, while well-executed maneuvers reinforced authority and strengthened bonds. The crew had learned that the effectiveness of their expansion was inseparable from the health of their internal dynamics, and that the greatest vulnerability often lay not in rivals, but in fractures within their own ranks. By the end of this period, the Melbourne Crew had moved beyond the subtle assertions of presence into the calculated management of conflict, influence, and reputation. The first rival confrontations had taught them lessons that would resonate throughout their ascent. Patience could be more powerful than aggression, perception often outweighed physical control, and alliances were as essential as personal skill. The city's underworld, once a loosely defined collection of local actors, now operated as a complex ecosystem in which the crew was an increasingly central, respected, and cautiously feared force. The streets of Melbourne, under the quiet glow of evening lights, reflected these shifts. Pubs, alleys, and backrooms bore witness to subtle maneuvers, careful negotiations, and quiet assertions of power that would leave lasting marks on the city's criminal landscape. Rival factions watched, learned, and adjusted, while the crew moved with calculated purpose, balancing expansion, influence, and internal cohesion. These early confrontations, measured and deliberate, marked the beginning of a new era, an era in which the Melbourne Crew was no longer just a group of ambitious youths, but a rising force, quietly reshaping the city's underworld one careful move at a time. With the early turf disputes largely navigated and subtle rivalries beginning to bend in their favor, the Melbourne Crew experienced its first tangible victories, moments that quietly but firmly established their reputation as a force to be reckoned with. These victories were rarely marked by dramatic violence or public spectacle. Instead, they were the accumulation of patient strategy, careful observation, and psychological mastery. Success was measured not only in terms of territory gained but in influence exerted, alliances strengthened, and the perception of reliability and competence that silently spread throughout the city's underworld. One of the crew's earliest achievements involved the control of a network of small clubs and social venues that had long been contested by minor factions. Rather than storming in with threats or displays of force, they quietly established presence through consistent engagement, assistance, and discreet protection arrangements. Staff, owners, and even rival patrons began to recognize the crew's members as figures of competence and authority. Minor disputes within the venues were resolved quickly and efficiently, demonstrating skill and discretion, earning respect without raising alarm beyond the immediate circles involved. By the time outsiders became aware, the crew's influence was already established, their authority quietly acknowledged. These successes had a compounding effect. Allies observed the crew's capability and reliability, while rivals noted the careful balance of assertiveness and restraint. Minor factions began to gravitate toward them, either seeking protection, alignment, or simply wanting to avoid conflict. The crew's growing network of allies extended their reach across multiple neighborhoods, allowing them to operate with greater freedom and confidence. Expansion was no longer merely an abstract ambition, it had become a practical reality, supported by a carefully managed ecosystem of relationships, influence, and reputation. At the same time, the crew began to understand the delicate art of deterrence. True power, they realized, often lay not in confrontation itself but in the perception of capability. A strategically placed member in a contested area, a quiet warning delivered through a trusted intermediary, or a subtle display of resources and connections could prevent conflict before it began. These actions were executed with calm precision, demonstrating that the crew's influence was both pervasive and disciplined. Rivals learned to respect boundaries, sometimes reluctantly, acknowledging the crew's growing control without the need for direct confrontation. Internal dynamics continued to play a critical role in these early victories. The crew's members had developed a culture of trust, coordination, and shared understanding that allowed them to act decisively when opportunities arose. Each member's role, whether in negotiation, surveillance, enforcement, or logistics, was crucial. Mistakes were analyzed quietly and constructively, ensuring that the group's collective strength was reinforced rather than undermined. These victories, therefore, were not the result of individual prowess alone but of a coordinated, disciplined unit operating with subtlety, patience, and strategic foresight. The crew also began to expand its influence into previously untapped areas of opportunity. Small businesses, underground enterprises, and social hubs offered avenues for both income and influence. The careful management of these operations, ensuring that transactions, favors, and interactions reinforced the crew's reputation, allowed them to consolidate power without attracting undue attention from law enforcement or hostile rivals. Each successful integration of a new venue or network was a quiet triumph, reinforcing both practical control and psychological authority. The psychological impact of these victories was significant. Success bred confidence, not arrogance, as the crew remained keenly aware that influence was fragile and required constant maintenance. Reputation, once established, could be easily damaged by missteps, betrayals, or miscalculations. This awareness fostered a disciplined approach, measured action, careful observation, and subtle assertion of authority. Allies and rivals alike began to recognize that the crew's victories were not fleeting or accidental, but the product of calculated strategy and consistent execution. The early triumphs also reinforced the importance of alliances and networks. Every victory, whether in negotiation, territorial assertion, or influence building, was strengthened by the careful cultivation of relationships. Neutral parties and minor factions often became silent supporters, providing intelligence, reinforcement, or simply recognition of authority. The crew learned to leverage these networks effectively, ensuring that their expanding influence was supported by both action and perception. Expansion, strategy, and alliance building became intertwined, each element reinforcing the other in a growing web of power. By this stage, Melbourne streets reflected the quiet but undeniable shift in power. Areas once contested or overlooked now responded to the crew's influence, not through overt displays but through recognition and subtle adjustment. Rival groups began to navigate their territories more cautiously, allies sought alignment more actively, and the broader underworld grew aware of a new, organized force quietly shaping the city's landscape. The crew's victories were not dramatic, they were the product of patience, insight, and disciplined execution, but their impact resonated far beyond the immediate circles, establishing a foundation for future growth, consolidation, and the inevitable conflicts that would define their legacy. These first victories were also deeply instructive. They confirmed the value of patience, observation, and subtlety, demonstrating that power could be asserted without unnecessary violence. They reinforced the importance of internal cohesion, disciplined roles, and trust, showing that a coordinated group operating with foresight could achieve far more than individual acts of audacity. They highlighted the interplay between perception and reality, teaching that influence could often be exercised most effectively through psychological leverage and quiet demonstration of capability. By the end of this period, the Melbourne Crew had moved from cautious expansion to tangible dominance in key areas. Their first victories, though modest compared to the legendary conflicts to come, had cemented their reputation and set the stage for a larger, more audacious phase of operations. The crew had learned that influence was a product of strategy, patience, and perception as much as it was of action. They were no longer merely a group of ambitious youths, they were an emerging power in Melbourne's underworld, quietly respected, cautiously feared, and poised for the next stage of their ascent. Following their first victories and the quiet consolidation of influence across several neighborhoods, the Melbourne Crew began to understand the full weight of power and the responsibilities that accompanied it. Expansion and dominance brought not only opportunity but also exposure. Allies looked to them for leadership and protection, while rivals scrutinized every move, searching for weakness or misstep. Even as their reputation grew, the Crew recognized that influence was fragile, maintained not by a single triumph but by consistent demonstration of competence, reliability, and strategic foresight. Every action now carried significance, both visible and invisible, and the stakes of miscalculation were higher than ever. One of the most important lessons during this period was the careful management of the city's underworld ecosystem. The Crew had grown beyond a single neighborhood or small network, and their activities now intersected with a complex web of factions, businesses, and informal power structures. Each decision had ripple effects: an ally strengthened, a rival placated, or a territory asserted could shift the balance in unforeseen ways. The Crew learned to operate with a delicate touch, guiding outcomes subtly, influencing perception, and maintaining relationships without unnecessary confrontation. In essence, they were no longer simply participants, they were orchestrators, carefully shaping the currents of the city's criminal world. Consolidation required formalizing roles and responsibilities within the Crew. Surveillance, enforcement, negotiation, logistics, and intelligence gathering became specialized functions, each carried out by members best suited to the task. This structure ensured that operations were coordinated and that no single error could jeopardize the group's influence. Trust, as always, remained the essential glue. Members were carefully vetted, and loyalty was continually reinforced through shared success, subtle accountability, and the quiet enforcement of internal codes. By embedding structure into their expansion, the Crew transformed from a loosely organized group of ambitious youths into a disciplined, strategic entity capable of operating on multiple fronts simultaneously. Territorial control became a focal point during this period. The Crew began to formalize their presence in key neighborhoods, identifying areas for active management and influence. Clubs, late-night businesses, and social venues were integrated into a broader network of operations, providing not only revenue but also intelligence, strategic access, and influence over local communities. These venues were managed discreetly, blending seamlessly into the city's ordinary rhythm while serving as hubs of the Crew's growing power. They became a tangible reflection of authority, signaling to both allies and rivals that the Crew was organized, capable, and quietly assertive. Expansion and consolidation also attracted attention beyond the immediate circles of the underworld. Law enforcement, while often unaware of the Crew's full capabilities, began to notice patterns, unexplained coordination across neighborhoods, subtle shifts in influence, and incidents of controlled conflict that hinted at a single organized force behind them. While the Crew had learned to operate with discretion, the mere perception of a growing organization drew scrutiny. This awareness introduced a new variable into their calculations: the need to manage visibility while maintaining influence, ensuring that their activities remained effective without inviting unnecessary intervention. Financial operations became increasingly sophisticated. Beyond minor protection arrangements or small-scale enterprises, the Crew identified opportunities to consolidate income streams, maintain loyalty, and reinforce influence simultaneously. Gambling, discreet lending, and the facilitation of small-scale illicit transactions provided both profit and leverage. Every financial arrangement, carefully structured, contributed to the Crew's reputation for competence, reliability, and strategic foresight. Even in these practical matters, subtlety remained essential. Overt displays could provoke rivals, while mismanagement could erode trust internally. Success lay in quiet control, not spectacle. The human element continued to define the Crew's consolidation. Relationships, observation, and psychological insight were as critical as any operational decision. Rivals were studied, their patterns, weaknesses, and alliances mapped meticulously. Allies were supported and subtly guided, reinforcing loyalty and ensuring alignment with the Crew's broader objectives. Communication, both explicit and implicit, was carefully managed to maintain cohesion while minimizing the risk of misunderstanding. Discipline, patience, and foresight became the hallmarks of the crew's identity, providing stability as they navigated increasingly complex and high-stakes interactions. This period also reinforced the importance of strategic patience. Opportunities often required waiting for the right alignment of circumstances, allies, and perception. Acting too early could provoke conflict or reveal vulnerabilities, while hesitation risked losing ground to rivals. The crew learned to calibrate timing precisely, executing maneuvers when conditions were most favorable and using observation to guide every decision. This approach emphasized the crew's growing sophistication. They were no longer reactive actors in the city's underworld, but proactive, strategic operators, shaping outcomes with foresight rather than relying on impulse. The combination of territorial influence, financial operations, disciplined roles, and strategic patience began to solidify the crew's image in Melbourne's underworld. They were no longer a collection of ambitious youths testing boundaries, they were recognized as a competent, organized, and quietly formidable force. Allies deferred to their judgment, rivals measured their moves carefully, and even the city itself seemed to bend subtly to their influence. This consolidation of power, while calm and understated, laid the foundation for the conflicts, alliances, and challenges that would define the crew's rise in the years to come. By the end of this phase, the Melbourne Crew had transformed fundamentally. They had learned that power was not just about territory, victories, or intimidation, it was about the careful management of relationships, perception, and opportunity. Influence was built through consistency, discretion, and strategic foresight, and maintained by disciplined internal cohesion and deliberate action. The crew stood as a quietly emerging force, their reputation firmly established, their network expanding, and their capacity to shape the city's criminal landscape growing with every measured decision. The streets of Melbourne, once merely a backdrop to youthful ambition, had become a map of influence, control, and opportunity, a map the crew now navigated with precision, patience, and quiet authority. As the Melbourne Crew's influence solidified across multiple neighborhoods, the inevitable escalation with rival factions began to take shape. These early confrontations were no longer subtle gestures or minor skirmishes, they represented the first true tests of the crew's ability to assert dominance while maintaining strategic control. Each encounter carried the weight of potential consequence, not only in terms of territory and influence but in the delicate balance of alliances, reputation, and internal cohesion that had been carefully nurtured over the preceding months. The crew had learned patience and observation, but now they faced a challenge that demanded decisive action, judgment, and foresight. The first large-scale confrontation emerged from a long-standing rivalry with a faction that had traditionally controlled a stretch of Fitzroy and Carlton. The area, known for its social venues, small businesses, and underground gatherings, had become increasingly influenced by the crew's subtle expansion efforts. While initial incursions had been carefully managed through negotiation, observation, and quiet displays of presence, tensions escalated when a local event brought rival factions into direct proximity. The room was thick with unspoken tension, every movement, glance, and whispered comment carried significance. The crew understood that misstep here could ignite an open conflict, but the opportunity to demonstrate authority and secure influence was too critical to ignore. Preparation and strategic foresight became paramount. Members of the crew meticulously mapped the environment, noting entrances, exits, and potential choke points, while also gathering intelligence on rival routines, alliances, and likely responses. Plans were discussed quietly, ensuring that each individual understood not only their own role but the subtle psychological interplay that would guide the encounter. The crew had learned from previous skirmishes that power was as much about perception as action, demonstrating calm confidence could shift the balance even before any confrontation began. Every decision was deliberate, every gesture intentional, and every action aimed at reinforcing the crew's growing reputation for disciplined authority. When the confrontation unfolded, it was executed with a combination of quiet assertiveness and precise coordination. The crew's presence in the contested area was deliberate but unassuming, signaling authority without provoking immediate aggression. Key members engaged with neutral or undecided parties first, establishing rapport and subtly undermining rival influence. Small acts, a discreet intervention in a minor dispute, a calm negotiation, or a demonstration of competence, served to project power without overt conflict. The rivals, observing these carefully orchestrated maneuvers, were forced to reassess their own positions, recognizing that the crew's influence could not be easily challenged. This early escalation highlighted the importance of psychological strategy. The crew understood that confidence, composure, and subtle intimidation could often achieve what direct aggression could not. A strategically timed gesture, a measured word, or even the quiet placement of a respected ally could shift perceptions and influence outcomes before any confrontation reached its peak. These tactics were as vital as physical presence, creating an environment in which rivals were compelled to respect authority and consider alliances carefully. The crew's mastery of these psychological dynamics reinforced both internal cohesion and external perception, establishing them as a force to be acknowledged, even feared, without the need for widespread violence. At the same time, the crew remained acutely aware of internal cohesion. The pressures of larger-scale confrontations could reveal weaknesses within the group, testing loyalty, judgment, and the discipline cultivated over previous months. Coordination, clear communication, and trust were essential. Each member had a role, whether negotiation, observation, enforcement, or logistics, and each action was carefully synchronized to support the collective objective. Mistakes, when they occurred, were addressed quietly and constructively, ensuring that the group emerged stronger and more unified. The internal stability of the crew was as critical to their success as the tactics employed externally. The confrontation also provided opportunities to solidify alliances. Neutral parties and minor factions, observing the crew's capability and composure under pressure, were drawn into alignment. Supporters provided intelligence, assistance, and quiet validation of the crew's authority. These alliances not only strengthened immediate outcomes but also created a broader network of influence that could be leveraged in future disputes. The interplay between action, perception, and alliance building became increasingly sophisticated, demonstrating the crew's growing understanding of power as a multidimensional force. Financial and territorial interests intertwined with these confrontations. Establishing authority over contested areas allowed the crew to expand influence over local businesses, underground operations, and revenue streams. Every act of control reinforced both perception and practical advantage, while careful management of relationships ensured that expansion did not provoke unnecessary attention from law enforcement or other rivals. The crew balanced ambition with discretion, understanding that the long-term stability of influence depended as much on subtlety as on action. By the end of this first major confrontation, the Melbourne Crew had achieved more than territorial advantage. They had demonstrated the ability to navigate high-stakes conflict with discipline, intelligence, and strategic foresight. Their reputation as a capable, organized, and patient force was reinforced both internally and externally. Rivals recognized that the crew's authority could not be easily challenged, allies gained confidence in their leadership, and the city's underworld began to adjust to the presence of a new, quietly formidable power. This period also reinforced key lessons for the crew. Patience, observation, and subtlety remained essential, but so too did decisive action when opportunity demanded it. Influence was built not solely through negotiation or presence but through the coordinated application of strategy, psychology, and disciplined execution. The interplay between internal cohesion and external projection of authority became a guiding principle, shaping the crew's approach to subsequent confrontations and their broader rise within Melbourne's criminal landscape. By this stage, the streets of Melbourne had begun to bear the invisible marks of the crew's growing power. The city's rhythms, once familiar, now reflected a subtle recalibration in response to their presence. Rivals measured their movements, allies sought alignment, and the crew operated with a quiet confidence born of careful preparation, strategic execution, and disciplined foresight. These early large-scale confrontations were not dramatic in spectacle, but their impact was profound, shaping the trajectory of the crew's ascent and setting the stage for increasingly complex, high-stakes conflicts in the years to come. After the first major confrontations with rival factions, the Melbourne Crew entered a period of consolidation, a careful recalibration of influence that reinforced their emerging dominance. These moments of pause were as critical as the conflicts themselves, allowing the crew to assess outcomes, manage alliances, and refine strategies. The victories had established reputation, but maintaining that perception required deliberate action. They understood that power, once asserted, was fragile, and that influence depended not solely on bold acts but on consistent, disciplined management of territory, relationships, and internal cohesion. The first step in consolidation involved securing the territories gained through careful negotiation and subtle assertion of authority. Local businesses, clubs, and underground operations were integrated into the crew's network, not through forceful imposition but by quietly demonstrating competence, reliability, and discretion. Owners and patrons were reassured that collaboration with the crew would bring protection, stability, and opportunity rather than unnecessary danger. This approach reinforced both practical control and psychological influence, subtly signaling to rivals and allies alike that the crew's presence was enduring and strategically grounded. Observation and intelligence remained central to this phase. The crew meticulously monitored rival movements, emerging alliances, and local sentiments. Even minor incidents, an argument in a pub, a disputed delivery, or a shift in neighborhood loyalties, were noted and assessed for their potential impact on the crew's influence. Information was carefully shared and analyzed within the group, ensuring that every member understood the broader context of their actions. This meticulous attention to detail allowed the crew to anticipate challenges before they materialized, reinforcing their reputation for foresight and strategic mastery. Internal cohesion continued to be a priority. The pressures of managing expanded influence and navigating complex rivalries required discipline, trust, and coordination. Members were expected to execute their roles with precision, whether in negotiation, enforcement, observation, or logistics. Mistakes were addressed quietly, with an emphasis on learning and adaptation, ensuring that the crew's unity remained intact. Loyalty was continually tested, not through dramatic displays but through the consistency of behavior, the fulfillment of responsibilities, and the quiet reinforcement of shared objectives. These internal structures became the foundation upon which the crew's sustained influence was built. During this period, the subtle escalation of turf wars began to shape the crew's broader strategies. Rivals, though cautious after earlier defeats, were still present, and their occasional attempts to challenge the crew's authority required measured responses. The crew relied on a combination of deterrence, negotiation, and selective assertion of power, ensuring that conflicts were resolved in a manner that reinforced influence without provoking open warfare. Even small confrontations were opportunities to demonstrate discipline, intelligence, and authority, signaling to both allies and competitors that the crew operated with foresight and restraint. Strategic alliances grew increasingly significant. Minor factions, previously neutral or aligned with rivals, were approached through subtle gestures of collaboration, assistance, or shared opportunity. These alliances not only strengthened the crew's practical reach but also reinforced the perception of authority, creating a network of influence that extended beyond immediate territories. Each relationship was carefully maintained, with attention to loyalty, capability, and strategic value. In this way, the crew transformed their initial victories into a broader system of power, integrating multiple actors and territories into a cohesive, discrete network of influence. Financial consolidation paralleled territorial and strategic consolidation. The crew's operations, ranging from discrete gambling and lending to the management of small businesses, were structured to reinforce loyalty, influence, and stability. Every transaction, favor, or arrangement was evaluated for its potential impact on reputation, relationships, and long-term opportunity. This careful attention ensured that economic activity was not only profitable but strategically aligned with the crew's broader objectives. Financial control became both a practical tool and a symbolic signal of authority, demonstrating that influence could be exercised in subtle, enduring ways. The psychological dimension of consolidation was also critical. The crew understood that perception often governed behavior more than reality alone. Controlled displays of competence, reliability, and composure reinforced their authority, shaping rival calculations and ally confidence. Even minor acts, resolving a conflict discreetly, demonstrating awareness of a potential threat, or managing a delicate negotiation, carried weight. Through these actions, the crew cultivated an aura of quiet mastery, signaling to the wider underworld that they were capable, disciplined, and strategically minded. This period also allowed for reflection on lessons learned from earlier confrontations. The crew assessed successes and failures, refining approaches to negotiation, influence, and deterrence. They identified vulnerabilities, both internal and external, and developed strategies to mitigate risk, ensuring that future expansion and confrontation could be managed with greater precision. Observation and analysis, once tools for learning, became instruments of proactive strategy, enabling the crew to anticipate developments and maintain the initiative in increasingly complex interactions. By the end of this consolidation phase, the Melbourne Crew had transformed from an emerging force into an established power within the city's underworld. Their influence was no longer limited to a few neighborhoods but extended through a network of alliances, controlled operations, and carefully managed perceptions. Rivals approached with caution, allies deferred with confidence, and the city's landscape subtly reflected their presence. The crew had learned that dominance was not a static state but a dynamic process requiring continual attention, strategic foresight, and disciplined execution. These months of consolidation set the stage for the next phase of the crew's story, the escalation of rivalries into more overt conflict, the challenges of managing expanding networks, and the increasing visibility that would inevitably draw attention from law enforcement. They had mastered the delicate balance of internal cohesion and external influence, transforming their early victories into a resilient foundation for sustained power. The streets of Melbourne, calm and bustling, bore silent witness to this quiet transformation, as the crew quietly prepared for the battles, both subtle and overt, that would define their ascent in the years to come. By the time the Melbourne Crew had completed the initial phases of consolidation, the city's underworld had shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, but the change was unmistakable to those who watched closely. The crew's influence had grown from cautious expansion to practical control, from quiet alliances to a complex web of interconnected relationships spanning multiple neighborhoods. Yet with growth came new challenges, some expected, others less so. Rivals, once subdued by subtle displays of authority, began to test boundaries again, emboldened by opportunity or resentment. It was a period of delicate tension, a moment where patience, observation, and calculated action would determine whether the crew's rising trajectory would continue or falter. The escalation of turf wars marked this chapter in their story. These conflicts were no longer minor skirmishes or subtle posturing, they involved the careful orchestration of multiple actors across neighborhoods, each with their own ambitions and vulnerabilities. The crew had to navigate not only their rivals' intentions but also the potential reactions of allies and neutral parties who might be drawn into the conflict inadvertently. Every move required foresight, every decision carried the weight of potential consequence, and even a small miscalculation could ripple outward, destabilizing relationships and influence alike. The stakes were higher, and the crew understood that success demanded precision, discipline, and psychological acuity. Betrayal, though still rare, began to surface as an ever-present risk. Trust, carefully cultivated over months of shared success and observation, could be undermined by ambition, fear, or the lure of opportunity. Even minor lapses in loyalty, rumors, secret alliances, or withheld information, had the potential to compromise operations or erode cohesion. The crew responded to these risks with subtlety and strategy rather than immediate retaliation. Observations were made quietly, conversations measured, and loyalty reinforced through shared responsibility and discreet accountability. The balance of trust and suspicion became an art form, shaping internal dynamics as much as external engagements. The crew's ability to navigate these tensions relied heavily on psychological insight. They learned that perception often held as much weight as action itself. A well-timed gesture, a measured intervention in a dispute, or a calm response to provocation could reinforce authority more effectively than overt aggression. Conversely, misread signals or unchecked emotions could embolden rivals or weaken internal cohesion. Each member's understanding of human behavior, relationships, and subtle social cues became a critical asset, allowing the crew to manage increasingly complex scenarios with composure and strategic clarity. Strategic alliances became even more vital during this period. Minor factions, previously neutral or loosely aligned, were courted carefully. The crew offered protection, support, and discreet collaboration, while simultaneously demonstrating capability and reliability. These alliances provided both practical assistance, such as intelligence, reinforcement, or access to disputed areas, and psychological reinforcement, signaling to rivals that the crew's influence was both deep and durable. The careful management of relationships became a defining characteristic of the crew's approach, ensuring that expansion and influence were reinforced at every turn. Territorial disputes, when they erupted, were managed with precision. The crew avoided unnecessary violence, relying instead on strategic displays of capability and authority. Subtle maneuvers, placing trusted members in key locations, intervening in minor conflicts, or quietly asserting influence over disputed operations, allowed them to maintain dominance while minimizing risk. These encounters served as both practical and symbolic victories, reinforcing reputation, deterring rivals, and consolidating allies. Even in moments of tension, the crew operated with discipline, ensuring that perception, strategy, and internal cohesion remained aligned. The psychological impact of these escalations extended beyond immediate conflicts. Rivals, observing the crew's calculated responses and strategic patience, were compelled to reconsider their approaches. Some attempted indirect challenges, probing weaknesses subtly, only to find themselves countered by the crew's foresight. Allies gained confidence, seeing that the crew's authority was not fleeting or reactive but deliberate, disciplined, and informed by experience. Over time, these subtle dynamics shifted the broader underworld, creating an environment in which the crew's influence was quietly acknowledged, respected, and cautiously feared. Internal cohesion was tested continuously during this period. The pressures of navigating escalated conflicts, managing alliances, and responding to betrayal demanded discipline, clear communication, and mutual trust. Each member's role was critical, and mistakes were addressed with measured guidance rather than rash punishment. The crew understood that internal stability was essential not only for operational effectiveness but also for the projection of authority externally. Loyalty, competence, and consistency became the pillars upon which the crew's rising power rested. Financial operations and practical influence were deeply intertwined with these escalating conflicts. Control over small businesses, underground enterprises, and revenue-generating activities provided both material resources and leverage over local communities. Every transaction, favor, and negotiation was evaluated not only for immediate gain but for its impact on long-term influence, alliances, and reputation. The crew's disciplined approach ensured that growth remained sustainable, risks were managed, and authority continued to expand without exposing vulnerabilities. By the end of this chapter, the Melbourne Crew had successfully navigated the early waves of heightened rivalry, betrayal, and subtle conflict. Their influence was no longer confined to select neighborhoods but had extended into a network of strategic alliances, controlled operations, and managed perceptions that spanned the city's criminal landscape. Rivals approached cautiously, allies deferred confidently, and the crew operated with the quiet authority of a group capable of both patience and decisive action. They had transformed early victories into durable power, and the city itself reflected the subtle yet profound impact of their growing dominance. This period taught the crew enduring lessons: power was both fragile and dynamic, trust had to be managed continually, perception could be as influential as action, and discipline, foresight, and subtlety were essential to sustaining influence. The crew had moved beyond mere ambition, evolving into a sophisticated organization capable of navigating complex social, territorial, and psychological landscapes. The stage was set for the next phase, where visibility, notoriety, and larger-scale conflicts would further define the trajectory of their rise, solidifying their place as a central force in Melbourne's criminal world. As the Melbourne Crew's influence spread and their network grew more complex, their operations became increasingly ambitious, bold, and, in some circles, notorious. These were not acts carried out for spectacle or ego, they were carefully planned endeavors that combined practical gain with the projection of authority. Each operation was executed with precision, the culmination of observation, strategic foresight, and the quiet discipline that had been honed over years of expansion, consolidation, and subtle confrontation. The crew had learned that reputation was built not only on victories or control but also on the perception of capability, and these operations reinforced the idea that their influence was both real and enduring. One of the crew's most significant undertakings during this period involved a coordinated series of activities across multiple neighborhoods, designed to consolidate financial control while subtly asserting territorial dominance. Small businesses, social venues, and underground operations were integrated into their network, not through overt intimidation but through careful negotiation, strategic alliances, and demonstrations of reliability. Owners and operators, observing the crew's competence in managing disputes and ensuring order, began to defer authority quietly, recognizing that cooperation offered protection, opportunity, and stability. These arrangements were delicate, requiring constant observation, subtle influence, and a keen understanding of human behavior. As these operations unfolded, the crew's reputation began to extend beyond the immediate underworld circles. Word of their capability, discretion, and strategic approach spread through informal networks, reaching allies, rivals, and even peripheral observers who had once dismissed them as minor players. This growing notoriety was a double-edged sword. While it reinforced authority and deterred potential challenges, it also drew attention from those who monitored the city's criminal landscape, including rival factions and, increasingly, law enforcement. The crew's challenge was to balance visibility with discretion, projecting influence without exposing vulnerabilities, and demonstrating competence without inviting unnecessary scrutiny. Financial operations were central to this period of heightened activity. The crew carefully managed revenue streams, integrating legitimate enterprises with underground operations in a manner that strengthened both income and influence. Gambling, discreet lending, and the facilitation of controlled transactions provided resources that reinforced authority and loyalty. Every financial maneuver was evaluated for strategic impact, how it would affect alliances, deter rivals, or enhance perception within the broader network. The careful orchestration of these activities reflected a sophisticated understanding that power was not merely the ability to control territory but the capacity to influence people, communities, and opportunities. Territorial management became more complex as the crew navigated neighborhoods where rival influence persisted. Subtle demonstrations of presence, placing trusted members in key locations, intervening discreetly in minor disputes, or orchestrating coordinated appearances, reinforced authority, while minimizing risk. Rivals learned that challenging the crew carried consequences, not through overt violence but through the quiet demonstration of strategic foresight and organizational capability. This blend of psychological influence and practical control became a hallmark of their operations, reinforcing both respect and caution among those who observed them. Alliances, too, played a crucial role. Minor factions and previously neutral figures were brought into the crew's orbit through a combination of subtle negotiation, assistance, and demonstration of reliability. Each alliance was carefully maintained, ensuring loyalty and reinforcing the crew's strategic position. These relationships extended the crew's reach, providing intelligence, reinforcement, and indirect influence across multiple neighborhoods. By the end of this period, the crew's network had grown into a web of interdependent actors, each contributing to the durability and resilience of their influence. The notoriety that accompanied these operations also introduced new tensions. Rivals, recognizing the crew's increasing authority, sought to challenge their position, sometimes overtly, sometimes through more subtle subversion or espionage. Internal cohesion was critical in managing these pressures. Members were expected to maintain discipline, coordinate their actions, and execute plans with precision. The crew had developed an internal culture of trust, accountability, and shared responsibility, which allowed them to navigate complex conflicts while preserving unity and effectiveness. Even minor lapses could be consequential, but the group's discipline ensured that operations proceeded with minimal disruption. Psychological strategy remained central to the crew's approach. They understood that perception often governed behavior as much as reality itself. Strategic gestures, measured interventions, and subtle displays of capability could deter aggression, reinforce alliances, and shape rival calculations without the need for open confrontation. Each operation, therefore, served multiple purposes: practical, financial, territorial, and psychological. The crew's understanding of these dimensions allowed them to operate with a quiet authority that was respected and cautiously feared throughout Melbourne's criminal landscape. The crew's growing notoriety also extended into public consciousness, though usually indirectly. Observers, business owners, community members, and peripheral figures began to recognize patterns of influence, coordinated interventions, and the quiet management of disputes. While few understood the full extent of the crew's operations, the perception of order, competence, and strategic capability spread organically. This reinforced the crew's authority, allowing them to exert influence beyond immediate transactions and territorial control. Reputation, as always, was both a tool and a shield. Even as their operations expanded in scope and ambition, the crew maintained a commitment to measured risk. Each undertaking was evaluated for potential exposure, consequences, and long-term strategic value. The balance between ambition and discretion, between practical gain and psychological influence, defined the crew's approach. They had learned that overextension, recklessness, or misjudgment could undermine even the most carefully cultivated authority. The discipline developed over years of observation, negotiation, and minor confrontations now guided increasingly complex and consequential operations. By the end of this period, the Melbourne Crew had firmly established themselves as a force of both practical power and quiet notoriety. Their operations were sophisticated, disciplined, and strategic, blending financial control, territorial influence, alliance management, and psychological insight into a cohesive approach. Rivals approached with caution, allies deferred with confidence, and the city's underworld had begun to acknowledge, subtly yet unmistakably, that the crew was a central, enduring presence. The stage was set for the next phase. As visibility, notoriety, and influence grew, the challenges would escalate, testing both the crew's internal cohesion and their ability to navigate increasingly complex, high-stakes conflicts. The lessons of this period were profound. Authority required patience, foresight, and discipline. Influence was as much about perception as direct control. Alliances, loyalty, and subtle negotiation were essential tools, and every action carried consequences that rippled through networks of power. The Melbourne Crew had transformed from a group of ambitious youths into a sophisticated, disciplined, and quietly formidable organization, capable of shaping the city's criminal landscape while navigating the intricate psychology of human behavior, perception, and trust. As the Melbourne Crew's reputation and influence solidified, the internal dynamics of the group became increasingly critical. Expansion, financial operations, and the management of alliances required coordination, trust, and subtle leadership. The crew had grown from a small network of ambitious youths into a structured, multifaceted organization. With this growth, the balance of power, the management of individual ambition, and the maintenance of loyalty became pressing concerns. Each member's role, whether in negotiation, enforcement, intelligence, or logistics, was essential, and even minor lapses could have significant consequences for both internal cohesion and external influence. Internal power dynamics began to surface as a quiet but persistent tension. Members who had demonstrated initiative, intelligence, or capability naturally sought greater influence within the group. While ambition was encouraged to a degree, it drove efficiency, innovation, and strategic thinking. It also required careful management to prevent rivalry or discord. The crew's leadership had to navigate these subtle ambitions, balancing recognition and authority, rewarding competence while ensuring that the collective mission remained paramount. Leadership was not exercised through overt domination but through guidance, strategic direction, and the cultivation of shared responsibility. Trust remained the foundation of internal stability. Every action taken by a member, every decision made in negotiation or enforcement, and every response to a challenge reflected on the crew as a whole. Breaches of trust, whether intentional or accidental, could destabilize operations, invite vulnerability, or erode confidence. The crew developed a culture in which loyalty was continuously tested, subtly reinforced, and quietly rewarded. Observation, communication, and accountability became integral to maintaining cohesion, and these practices ensured that the organization could operate with a remarkable degree of reliability even under pressure. As internal dynamics evolved, the crew also faced external pressures that tested both strategy and discipline. Rival factions, emboldened by their own networks and ambitions, began probing weaknesses in the crew's expanding influence. These challenges ranged from subtle encroachments on territory to more aggressive attempts to destabilize alliances or undermine credibility. The crew responded with a combination of measured deterrence, careful negotiation, and strategic intelligence. Confrontations were deliberate and controlled, ensuring that authority was reinforced without unnecessary exposure or escalation. Each response served not only to maintain influence but to communicate the disciplined cohesion of the group to both allies and rivals. Psychological strategy remained central to internal and external operations alike. Members were trained to recognize patterns of behavior, anticipate responses, and manage perceptions. Rival factions were influenced not only through direct intervention but through subtle displays of capability, discretion, and calculated influence. Within the crew, individuals learned to navigate ambition, loyalty, and responsibility, understanding that perception shaped behavior as much as reality did. This cultivation of psychological awareness created a resilient organization capable of strategic adaptation in the face of both internal and external pressures. Financial management, as always, reinforced both internal authority and external influence. Revenue streams from gambling, discreet lending, and controlled underground operations were carefully allocated, ensuring operational continuity while strengthening loyalty. Members were entrusted with responsibilities that reflected both competence and reliability, and success was recognized quietly but decisively. The integration of practical operations with strategic oversight reinforced the crew's internal hierarchy, subtly rewarding initiative while maintaining collective accountability. These financial structures became a mechanism for trust, loyalty, and cohesion, binding the organization together as it prepared for the more dangerous conflicts that lay ahead. The period also introduced the first signs of tension stemming from differences in vision and approach. Some members favored aggressive expansion, rapid acquisition of influence, and the decisive elimination of rivals, while others advocated for caution, subtle negotiation, and measured psychological influence. Leadership navigated these differences through discussion, observation, and strategic alignment, ensuring that the collective mission remained clear and coherent. The ability to balance competing perspectives, channel ambition, and maintain unity became a defining characteristic of the crew's operational culture. Operational planning grew increasingly sophisticated. Coordinated maneuvers across multiple neighborhoods required precise timing, communication, and the anticipation of both ally and rival actions. Surveillance, intelligence gathering, negotiation, and enforcement were executed with a high degree of synchronization, ensuring that each initiative reinforced both practical influence and psychological authority. Mistakes, when they occurred, were studied quietly and used to refine protocols, reinforcing a culture of continuous learning and strategic adaptation. This disciplined approach allowed the crew to operate with confidence, even as stakes rose and challenges became more complex. The internal structure of the crew also facilitated the management of emerging crises. Rival encroachments, minor betrayals, and unexpected challenges were addressed through collective deliberation, careful allocation of responsibility, and measured execution. This resilience was a product of both organizational discipline and the cultivation of psychological insight. Members understood not only their tasks but also the broader context of influence, alliance, and perception in which they operated. The crew had become a dynamic system, capable of adjusting, reinforcing, and consolidating authority even under pressure. By the end of this period, the Melbourne Crew had reached a stage where internal power dynamics, loyalty, and strategic discipline were as critical to success as territorial control or financial operations. The organization had developed the capacity to integrate diverse perspectives, manage ambition, and maintain cohesion under stress. The leadership's ability to balance authority, encourage initiative, and cultivate trust ensured that the crew was prepared for the increasingly high-stakes confrontations and complex operations that would define the next phase of their story. The lessons learned during this stage were profound. Authority was most effective when paired with strategic guidance, trust was both fragile and essential, and internal cohesion determined the group's ability to respond effectively to external pressures. Ambition could be harnessed constructively when balanced with accountability, and psychological insight was as valuable as practical skill. The crew had evolved from a loosely connected group of ambitious youths into a disciplined, resilient, and strategically sophisticated organization, capable of navigating both internal dynamics and external threats with precision, foresight, and quiet authority. As the Melbourne Crew prepared for larger confrontations with rival factions and the heightened visibility that would come with notoriety, they did so with a confidence born of experience, discipline, and strategic cohesion. The internal framework they had established, combining trust, accountability, specialization, and psychological insight, would allow them to operate with remarkable effectiveness, even in the face of danger, uncertainty, and the growing complexity of the city's criminal landscape. The stage was set for the next chapter, the inevitable escalation into more dangerous rivalries, high-stakes operations, and the challenges that would test both the limits of their internal cohesion and the breadth of their influence across Melbourne. The Melbourne Crew's growth and consolidation, paired with internal cohesion and disciplined strategy, inevitably brought them into direct conflict with rivals who had long considered certain neighborhoods and operations as their own. These first deadly confrontations were not reckless brawls or spontaneous outbursts, they were carefully calculated encounters, designed to assert authority, deter future challenges, and protect the crew's expanding network. The city's streets, often calm in appearance, now bore the tension of invisible currents, a quiet yet potent struggle for dominance that would ripple through the underworld for years to come. The first of these serious clashes emerged over contested territory in the northern suburbs, where a rival faction had maintained long-standing control over social venues, gambling dens, and small businesses. The crew, having gradually established influence in adjacent areas, recognized both the opportunity and necessity of challenging these holdings. The planning was meticulous, reconnaissance, timing, placement of trusted members, and observation of rival routines were all considered. Every detail was accounted for, as even the smallest oversight could escalate the conflict beyond control. The goal was not indiscriminate violence, but controlled, decisive action that would reinforce the crew's authority while minimizing risk to its members and allies. Execution of the first deadly confrontations relied heavily on coordination and psychological strategy. Members of the crew moved in deliberate synchrony, maintaining calm composure even as tensions simmered. The appearance of authority was as crucial as actual enforcement. A well-timed intervention, a measured confrontation, or a subtle show of presence could convey dominance without immediate bloodshed. Rivals were carefully observed, their reactions gauged, and contingencies prepared to respond to any escalation. The crew understood that perception often shaped behavior as much as reality did, and they used this insight to guide every move, reinforcing respect, fear, and recognition of competence. The confrontations themselves were precise, controlled, and impactful. The crew aimed to neutralize threats, secure disputed operations, and demonstrate their capacity for decisive action without provoking full-scale war. Violence, when necessary, was measured and deliberate, emphasizing deterrence rather than chaos. Even minor acts, a strategic strike on an influential figure, the quiet removal of a rival from a critical venue, or the assertion of control over a key operational point, had profound consequences, shifting perception and recalibrating the balance of power across multiple neighborhoods. Each encounter served to reinforce both practical control and psychological authority, cementing the crew's reputation as a disciplined and formidable force. These first deadly confrontations also highlighted the importance of loyalty and trust within the crew. Members were expected to maintain discipline under extreme pressure, execute their roles with precision, and adhere to agreed strategies without hesitation. The internal cohesion built over months of consolidation proved critical. Any deviation, lapse in judgment, or breach of trust could have compromised the operation, yet the crew's culture of accountability, shared responsibility, and measured communication ensured that each initiative proceeded smoothly. Internal stability became both a tool and a shield, allowing the crew to operate with confidence even in high-stakes scenarios. Territorial control, once abstract or symbolic, now took on life-or-death significance. Securing contested areas required the integration of practical enforcement with psychological influence. Trusted members were strategically positioned in key locations, minor conflicts were resolved discreetly but firmly, and subtle messaging reinforced the crew's authority. Rivals learned that challenges would be met not with chaos but with calm, coordinated, and disciplined action. The impact of these confrontations extended beyond immediate outcomes, shaping behavior and perceptions across the city's underworld in ways that ensured the crew's influence would endure. Financial and operational considerations remained central even during deadly encounters. Revenue streams, from gambling to discreet lending and small enterprises, were closely guarded and strategically leveraged. Control over these resources provided both practical benefits and leverage in negotiations with allies and rivals alike. Every action, every maneuver, and every allocation of resources reinforced the crew's reputation for competence, discipline, and foresight. These operations demonstrated that power was not solely about territory or violence but about the strategic integration of influence, resources, and perception. The escalation into deadly confrontations also brought new challenges in intelligence and observation. Rivals began to adapt, probing weaknesses, testing loyalties, and attempting to disrupt operations. The crew responded with meticulous surveillance, careful analysis of behavior, and strategic interventions designed to neutralize threats before they could escalate. Anticipating rival actions became a critical skill, and the ability to project strength while maintaining flexibility and discretion proved invaluable. Each successful maneuver reinforced the crew's position, while each carefully managed setback offered lessons for refinement and adaptation. Psychological strategy was increasingly intertwined with practical action. The crew understood that intimidation, deterrence, and influence could be exercised quietly and effectively. Measured gestures, strategic placement, and subtle communication often conveyed authority more powerfully than overt displays of force. Even during deadly confrontations, the crew maintained composure, projecting confidence and control that reverberated through both allies and adversaries. This blend of calm authority and precise action became a hallmark of their approach, allowing them to assert dominance without unnecessary exposure or risk. By the conclusion of these early deadly confrontations, the Melbourne Crew had not only defended and expanded their influence but had also solidified their reputation for discipline, strategy, and foresight. Rivals approached with caution, allies deferred with confidence, and the city's criminal landscape reflected the quiet but undeniable presence of a formidable organization. The lessons of these encounters were profound. Discipline, cohesion, psychological insight, and strategic foresight were as critical to survival as any physical confrontation. The crew had transitioned from a group of ambitious youths to a mature, resilient, and strategically sophisticated entity capable of navigating life-or-death situations with calm precision. These early deadly confrontations marked a turning point in the crew's evolution. They demonstrated that influence could be asserted decisively without resorting to chaos, that power was maintained through strategic discipline as much as through force, and that reputation, carefully cultivated over years of subtle operations, was an enduring form of currency. The streets of Melbourne, once familiar, now bore the imprint of these carefully orchestrated conflicts. The crew had begun to shape not only territory but the behavior, expectations, and perceptions of all who moved within the city's underworld, setting the stage for even larger, more complex, and high-stakes confrontations that would define the next chapter of their ascent. With the first deadly confrontations behind them, the Melbourne Crew entered a period where their growing notoriety began to shape both their opportunities and their dangers. The city, which had once been a patchwork of loosely defined territories, now bore the subtle marks of the Crew's influence. Businesses, social venues, and underground operations began to reflect the quiet authority that the Crew exerted, while rivals, wary of prior encounters, adjusted their behavior cautiously. This period was characterized by the delicate interplay of expanding influence, emerging threats, and the ever-present need to maintain internal cohesion, all under the heightened visibility that came with rising notoriety. The escalation of citywide turf wars became more pronounced. Rivals, unwilling to accept the Crew's increasing dominance without resistance, began probing in subtle and overt ways. Minor factions tested boundaries through encroachments, covert operations, or attempts to sway neutral allies. These actions were calculated, designed to gauge the Crew's response, expose weaknesses, or create friction within alliances. Each challenge required careful assessment. The Crew had learned that reaction without forethought could create vulnerabilities, while inaction could embolden rivals. Strategy, observation, and calculated responses became critical in navigating this heightened period of tension. Internal discipline proved indispensable during these times. Members were expected to execute their roles with precision, maintain loyalty under pressure, and coordinate actions seamlessly across multiple neighborhoods. The complexity of managing simultaneous operations, alliances, and rivalries required clear communication and mutual trust. Internal meetings, often quiet and deliberate, focused on planning, intelligence sharing, and evaluation of past encounters. Every member understood that personal ambition had to be balanced with collective responsibility, and that internal discord could be exploited by observant rivals. This culture of disciplined cohesion allowed the Crew to maintain both flexibility and resilience, even as stakes rose. Psychological strategy remained at the forefront of the Crew's approach. The careful projection of authority, composure, and capability became a tool for deterring challenges before they could escalate. Even seemingly minor gestures, occupying a strategic venue, a calm intervention in a dispute, or the discreet placement of a trusted member, sent signals to allies and rivals alike. Reputation, painstakingly cultivated over months and years, was reinforced in ways that extended beyond immediate operations. Allies gained confidence, rivals hesitated, and neutral parties recognized the Crew's influence as enduring and authoritative. Financial management continued to underpin influence and operational stability. The Crew's revenue streams, from gambling and lending to underground enterprises, were carefully allocated not just for profit but for strategic reinforcement of authority. Investments in alliances, support for loyal members, and subtle interventions in rival territories ensured that resources strengthened both practical operations and perception. Every decision carried a dual purpose: immediate advantage and long-term consolidation of influence. The integration of finance, operations, and strategy became a defining characteristic of the Crew's approach, allowing them to exert authority quietly yet effectively. As notoriety grew, law enforcement attention began to emerge as a latent challenge. The Crew understood that visibility, while reinforcing influence and reputation within the underworld, could attract scrutiny from authorities. They adapted by enhancing discretion, refining operational protocols, and emphasizing subtlety over spectacle. The ability to operate under observation without compromising control became a key strategic skill. This constant balancing act, between influence, notoriety, and discretion, defined the Crew's operational philosophy and shaped their decisions during this critical period. The intensification of citywide turf wars also highlighted the importance of alliances. Minor factions and previously neutral actors became increasingly significant, either as potential reinforcements or sources of intelligence. The Crew nurtured these relationships through careful negotiation, discreet support, and the projection of reliability. Each alliance reinforced practical power while also shaping the broader perception of authority. Rivals, observing the cohesion and reach of these networks, approached with caution, recognizing that challenges would be met not only by individual members but by a coordinated, strategically aware organization. Internal tension, though managed effectively, became more apparent as the crew navigated these pressures. The demands of coordination, vigilance, and operational complexity occasionally strained relationships, highlighted differences in temperament or approach, and created moments of friction. Leadership addressed these tensions with patience and strategic guidance, reinforcing shared goals and emphasizing collective responsibility. Trust, loyalty, and competence were continuously evaluated and subtly reinforced, ensuring that the crew's internal stability remained aligned with the challenges posed by external threats. The period also revealed the crew's growing ability to anticipate and shape rival behavior. By observing patterns, predicting responses, and employing strategic subtlety, the crew often influenced outcomes before direct confrontation was necessary. Rivals hesitated, minor factions deferred, and neutral parties aligned quietly, often without realizing the extent of the crew's strategic orchestration. The psychological dimension of influence, anticipation, perception management, and disciplined presence, proved as powerful as any physical intervention, allowing the crew to maintain authority with efficiency and control. By the end of this phase, the Melbourne Crew had transformed the landscape of the city's underworld. Their influence extended through a network of territories, operations, and alliances, each carefully integrated and reinforced through discipline, strategy, and psychological insight. Rival factions approached with caution, aware that challenges could provoke coordinated, precise responses. Allies deferred with confidence, reassured by the crew's demonstrated capability and reliability. Even neutral observers recognized the crew as a central, enduring force, capable of shaping both perception and reality across the criminal landscape. This stage of expanding notoriety, intensified turf wars, and strategic mastery set the stage for subsequent challenges. The crew's operations had grown in sophistication and visibility, requiring constant attention to internal dynamics, alliances, and strategic foresight. The lessons learned were profound. Authority was most effective when disciplined and deliberate, perception could amplify influence as much as direct action, loyalty and cohesion were essential under pressure, and every decision carried both immediate and long-term consequences. The Melbourne Crew had evolved into a mature, resilient, and strategically sophisticated organization, fully prepared for the heightened stakes, public attention, and complex rivalries that would define the next phase of their ascent. By the time the Melbourne Crew reached the height of their influence, the city had quietly transformed beneath their careful orchestration. Neighborhoods that had once been fragmented, ruled by disparate factions, now reflected the subtle yet pervasive presence of the crew. Their influence was not always visible in the bright lights or the casual passerby's day, but it was felt in the patterns of behavior, the decisions of local business owners, and the cautious movements of rival factions. At this peak, the crew had mastered the delicate balance between visibility and discretion, combining practical authority with psychological influence to shape outcomes across the city's criminal landscape. The streets themselves seemed to respond to this quiet dominance. Social venues, gambling halls, and small enterprises operated under the watchful eye of the crew, often without overt signs of control. Local operators had learned that cooperation brought stability and opportunity, while resistance carried subtle but clear consequences. This equilibrium was the result of years of careful planning, observation, and disciplined action, in which each member of the crew understood their role in maintaining both influence and discretion. The perception of order, competence, and strategic mastery reinforced the crew's authority as much as any direct confrontation could. At the same time, the crew's notoriety had become a double-edged sword. While rivals were deterred and allies reassured, the growing reputation attracted attention beyond the underworld. Peripheral observers, business owners, law enforcement, journalists, began to notice patterns of influence, unusual consistency in operations, and the quiet management of disputes. This attention created a tension between the need for visibility to assert authority and the imperative of discretion to avoid exposure. The crew responded by refining operational protocols, increasing subtlety in high-stakes situations, and emphasizing psychological strategy to maintain control without drawing undue scrutiny. Territorial dominance at this stage was both practical and symbolic. Key neighborhoods were managed through strategic placement of trusted members, the resolution of disputes with precision, and the careful monitoring of rival movements. Each intervention reinforced authority while minimizing risk, demonstrating the crew's capacity for calculated action rather than impulsive aggression. Rivals, recognizing the sophistication and cohesion of the organization, approached with caution, understanding that challenges could be met with coordinated responses, careful observation, and strategic subtlety. This dynamic further solidified the crew's reputation as disciplined, capable, and formidable. Financial influence remained central to the crew's power. Revenue streams from gambling, underground enterprises, and discreet lending were meticulously managed, ensuring both operational continuity and strategic reinforcement of authority. Funds were allocated to maintain loyalty, support allies, and influence rival calculations. Each financial decision carried both immediate and long-term implications, reinforcing the perception of competence, control, and foresight. The crew's ability to integrate economic power with territorial and psychological influence became a hallmark of their peak operational capacity. The psychological dimension of power reached its most refined stage during this period. Members were adept at projecting calm authority, interpreting rival behavior, and influencing perception through subtle, disciplined actions. Even minor gestures, a quiet intervention in a dispute, the strategic occupation of a location, or measured engagement with neutral parties, conveyed competence, control, and strategic insight. The crew's mastery of perception management ensured that their influence extended beyond direct action, shaping the behavior of allies, rivals, and observers alike without the need for overt confrontation. Internal cohesion remained a defining characteristic. Despite the pressures of visibility, operational complexity, and high-stakes rivalry, the crew maintained unity through disciplined communication, accountability, and shared responsibility. Ambition and differing perspectives were balanced by leadership that emphasized collective goals, strategic alignment, and the long-term interests of the organization. Members understood that their personal actions had repercussions not only for themselves but for the crew as a whole, reinforcing a culture of responsibility and mutual trust. At the peak of influence, the crew's interactions with rival factions became more sophisticated. Minor provocations were addressed through subtle strategic maneuvers rather than immediate conflict. Direct confrontations were carefully orchestrated, ensuring that outcomes reinforced authority while minimizing risk. Even in situations that could have escalated into violence, the crew relied on a combination of intelligence, observation, and psychological insight to achieve objectives. This approach allowed them to maintain dominance without provoking widespread instability or attracting excessive attention. Public perception of the crew, though often indirect, was increasingly shaped by a combination of fear, respect, and intrigue. Observers recognized patterns of authority and control, subtle yet consistent in their execution. Business owners complied quietly, social operators deferred, and rival factions calculated their moves with care. The crew had mastered the art of influencing behavior through the perception of competence and strategic foresight, demonstrating that reputation could be as powerful a tool as any physical intervention. Yet, even at this height, vulnerabilities began to emerge. The crew's visibility, while reinforcing authority, created new risks. Law enforcement interest, rival espionage, and internal pressure were constant concerns. The sophistication of operations required ongoing vigilance, disciplined execution, and continual refinement of strategy. Small missteps or lapses in judgment could have disproportionate consequences. The crew's leadership recognized that peak influence was both a reward and a burden, demanding careful navigation to sustain dominance without inviting destabilizing challenges. The city itself, as it reflected the crew's peak influence, became a stage for strategic maneuvering and subtle displays of power. Territories were managed with precision, alliances maintained through careful negotiation, and conflicts resolved in ways that reinforced authority while minimizing overt disruption. The interplay of financial control, territorial management, and psychological influence ensured that the crew's reach extended across multiple dimensions, creating a network of authority that was resilient, disciplined, and enduring. By the end of this period, the Melbourne Crew had reached a point where their dominance was undeniable, their operational sophistication unmatched, and their influence both feared and respected. Rival factions were deterred, allies were confident, and even neutral observers recognized the strategic mastery of the organization. Yet the peak of power also carried the implicit reminder that influence, once fully realized, invites both attention and opposition. The Crew had achieved remarkable control over the city's underworld, but the stage was set for challenges that would test not only their operations but also the resilience, discipline, and cohesion that had carried them to this apex. The lessons of this phase were profound. Authority required integration of strategy, psychology, and operational precision. Perception could amplify influence as effectively as action. Internal cohesion determined the ability to navigate high-stakes pressures, and even at peak dominance, vigilance was essential. The Melbourne Crew had become a sophisticated, disciplined, and formidable force, capable of shaping behavior, alliances, and outcomes across the city. Their influence was now both a legacy and a responsibility, preparing them for the forthcoming turning points that would challenge their strength, test their discipline, and reveal the vulnerabilities that come with visibility and power. Even at the height of their influence, the Melbourne Crew's carefully constructed world began to show subtle signs of strain. Rival factions, having endured years of calculated deterrence, started to regroup and reassess strategies, probing the Crew's operations with renewed determination. These challenges were rarely overt at first, minor encroachments, discreet alliances, and calculated disruptions served as early indicators of pressure. The Crew's leadership understood that the nature of power is impermanent, that every peak carries with it the seeds of potential decline, and that sustained dominance required continuous vigilance and adaptation. Law enforcement attention gradually intensified during this period. Investigations, surveillance, and intelligence-gathering operations increased in both scope and sophistication. The Crew, long accustomed to operating in the shadowed corners of Melbourne, found themselves navigating a new landscape where visibility brought legal scrutiny alongside underworld influence. Meetings once conducted with casual discretion were now meticulously planned to avoid detection. Trusted members were tasked not only with operational duties but also with maintaining secrecy, monitoring potential leaks, and ensuring that the organization's activities remained below the threshold that would invite immediate intervention. Internal pressure became more pronounced as the Crew faced the dual challenge of external threats and heightened law enforcement interest. The stress of constant vigilance, coupled with the complexity of coordinating widespread operations, tested the loyalty and composure of members. Ambition, which had previously been harnessed constructively, now sometimes manifested as impatience or disagreement about strategic direction. Leadership addressed these tensions quietly, emphasizing collective responsibility, discipline, and foresight, yet subtle cracks began to emerge. The dynamics that had once ensured cohesion now required extraordinary attention to prevent small issues from escalating into fractures. Rival factions, emboldened by glimpses of vulnerability, escalated their tactics. Minor incursions into Crew-controlled territory, subtle interference in operations, and the cultivation of disaffected members within the organization began to erode the seamless control the Crew had maintained. Each act, while individually minor, created cumulative pressure, requiring measured responses that balanced authority with discretion. The Crew had learned the value of strategic patience, yet the growing intensity of these challenges tested both the organization's capacity and its members' endurance. Financial pressures also became more complex. Increased scrutiny, the need for discrete operations, and the costs of managing heightened threats required careful allocation of resources. Revenue streams, while still substantial, were now carefully monitored to ensure operational sustainability, internal loyalty, and strategic flexibility. Every decision carried amplified consequences, reinforcing the idea that peak influence is fragile and that both internal management and external perception must be continually harmonized. The Crew's psychological strategies were tested as never before. Subtle intimidation, controlled interventions, and disciplined displays of authority continued to play a role, but rivals and observers alike were now more adept at detecting, circumventing, or countering these maneuvers. Anticipating responses, managing perceptions, and maintaining composure became critical in every interaction. Even minor lapses in judgment or confidence could embolden rivals or destabilize alliances, emphasizing the delicate balance between influence and overextension. As pressures mounted, the crew's internal structure became both an asset and a vulnerability. Trusted members were responsible for managing operations, intelligence, and communication, yet the sheer complexity of the network made complete oversight challenging. Subtle miscommunications, delayed actions, or lapses in coordination risked undermining authority. Leadership intensified efforts to reinforce protocols, ensure accountability, and monitor morale, recognizing that internal cohesion was as crucial to survival as territorial control or financial strength. The first major signs of downfall emerged through strategic disruptions orchestrated by rival factions. Key territories experienced subtle interference in operations, alliances began to fray under pressure, and intelligence networks were tested by rival infiltration. The crew's responses were precise, coordinated, and effective, yet these actions highlighted the growing tension between maintaining authority and managing cumulative stressors. The balance that had sustained their dominance now required constant vigilance, adaptability, and an almost preternatural awareness of both external and internal dynamics. External attention, both legal and underworld, began to intersect in ways that challenged the crew's long-standing operational philosophy. Law enforcement inquiries disrupted certain revenue streams and limited the freedom with which members could maneuver. Rival factions exploited these limitations, applying subtle pressure that forced the crew to stretch resources, test loyalty, and navigate complex social and operational challenges. Each encounter underscored the reality that influence, no matter how disciplined or pervasive, is inherently dynamic and subject to forces both visible and invisible. The psychological toll on members became increasingly apparent. Even the most disciplined individuals were affected by the constant tension, heightened stakes, and awareness of potential exposure. Leadership emphasized composure, mutual support, and strategic patience, yet the cumulative weight of challenges, internal ambition, rival encroachments, legal scrutiny, and operational complexity, created an atmosphere of quiet strain. The crew had learned that dominance requires more than tactical skill, it requires resilience, endurance, and the capacity to navigate uncertainty without compromising cohesion or authority. By the end of this period, the Melbourne Crew had begun to sense the fragility inherent in their previously unchallenged dominance. External pressures, rival resurgence, and the intensifying gaze of law enforcement had introduced vulnerabilities that required constant attention. Internal cohesion, once largely stable, now demanded extraordinary effort to maintain. The early signs of decline were subtle yet unmistakable: minor disruptions in operations, emerging tensions within the group, and the realization that even the most disciplined and sophisticated organization is not immune to the forces of opposition, scrutiny, and internal strain. The lessons of this phase were both stark and instructive. Dominance is never absolute, reputation and influence must be continuously reinforced, loyalty requires nurturing under stress, and the perception of strength must be harmonized with operational reality. The crew's experiences during this period foreshadowed the more significant challenges ahead, illustrating that the path from peak influence to vulnerability is rarely sudden but often gradual, marked by cumulative pressures that test every facet of leadership, discipline, and cohesion. The Melbourne Crew had reached a crossroads. Their previous success had been built on strategy, discipline, and cohesion, yet the growing pressures of external threats and internal strain now demanded adaptability, foresight, and resilience. The next phase of their story would reveal the consequences of these mounting challenges, testing both the organization's operational capacity and the strength of the bonds that had held them together through years of careful planning, strategic growth, and disciplined execution. The city itself, shaped by their dominance, now awaited the unfolding of both their vulnerabilities and the potential for resurgence or decline. As the era of the Melbourne Crew quietly drew to a close, their presence lingered in the subtle patterns of the city. The streets, once marked by contested territories and hidden rivalries, now reflected the enduring influence of an organization that had mastered strategy, discipline, and perception. Neighborhoods, social venues, and underground operations carried the traces of the crew's careful orchestration. Even in decline, their legacy of fear, respect, and psychological authority remained palpable, leaving an indelible imprint on both allies and rivals. The crew's decline was gradual, shaped by a combination of rival resurgence, law enforcement scrutiny, and internal pressures. Minor fractures in alliances, lapses in coordination, and the inevitable wear of constant vigilance began to test the resilience of even the most loyal members. Yet, throughout this period, leadership maintained careful guidance, ensuring that the organization retained cohesion as it navigated the mounting challenges. The same principles that had guided their rise, discipline, strategy, and subtle psychological influence, remained central, even as vulnerabilities emerged. Financial management, strategic alliances, and controlled territorial influence had been central to their power, and these elements continued to reflect their sophisticated operational approach. Money was allocated with purpose, both to sustain operations and reinforce loyalty. Territories were managed with precision, demonstrating that authority could be asserted without chaos. Psychological mastery, perhaps the crew's most enduring skill, allowed them to project competence and control, ensuring that their influence persisted even as direct dominance waned. The human element, the relationships formed through shared risk, loyalty, and coordination, was a lasting aspect of the crew's legacy. Bonds forged under pressure, tested through both internal and external challenges, reflected the careful balance of trust and responsibility that had allowed the organization to function effectively. Even as individuals moved on or faced new circumstances, the imprint of these connections shaped their decisions, allegiances, and understanding of power. Ultimately, the Melbourne Crew's story is a study in both mastery and impermanence. Their rise demonstrates the power of strategy, psychological insight, and disciplined execution. Their peak reflects the culmination of years of careful orchestration, while their decline underscores the inherent fragility of influence, shaped by external pressures and internal strain. Yet their legacy endures in the lessons left behind. Authority requires balance, perception is as vital as action, and even the most disciplined organization is subject to the subtle forces of change. Even as the city returned to a quieter rhythm, the crew's impact remained, a testament to the careful, deliberate, and sophisticated ways in which they shaped Melbourne's underworld. Their story is remembered not simply for power or violence, but for the strategic acumen, psychological mastery, and measured authority that defined an era. It is a legacy of influence, subtle yet profound, lingering in the city's memory long after the crew themselves had receded into history.